sessions that is near and dear to my heart. It is one of the 5 business practices, and ethics is one of the 5 mandatory modules towards your CPC. We're going to pop out of this screen and go into a share screen mode. So if you'll just bear with me for a second, I will figure out how to do that. And hopefully, share screen. Let's go over here. And then I'm going to have to launch the presentation once we get there, but we're just on the front screen. So hopefully you can see the screen. And if you're not able to see the screen, then unmute yourself and let me know. Also, a little disclaimer. I was doing some other work with another client, and I've got the whole professional microphone setup thing happening today, which sometimes doesn't work so great with Zoom. It works when we're recording and doing video and audio things for recording, but not so much with Zoom. So if you have a hard time hearing me, if I'm breaking up, please let me know. And when we take our break, or maybe even before that, we'll break earlier and I'll change my setup here. So today's business practices and ethics, one of the sessions that is near and dear to my heart. It's one of the 5 CPC sessions that are required towards the CPC certifications. And, you know, as we do in each one of our CPC courses, we talk about those 5, just kind of remind you that they cover legal aspects of staffing and legal aspects of recruitment. So one is industry specific, and the other, although it does apply specifically to the industry, it also applies to all of our clients. From a human resources perspective. There's the health and safety module, recruitment and selection, and of course, the session that we have today. And that's all followed up with your CPC challenge exam that you can schedule at your own time. It is an online exam for cheaters who wish to have all their notes available to them. Don't worry about it. It's not really cheating. What we really expect from the CPC and through the exam is not for you to memorize all of the little details of how many weeks of notice are allowed or what percentage of something is allowed. I mean, the important thing is that through these CPC courses that you understand what types of legislation exist and what they apply to, knowing that things change all the time. So you'll know, hey, we better look that up before we sign that piece of paper, before we terminate someone or hire someone or put it in a contract. When issues arise, you'll know what those issues are and where to go find the right answers. And don't worry so much about memorizing all the little tiny objectives. We're going to be talking a lot today about the ACSESS Code of Ethics and Standards and how it applies to you. So we'll talk a little bit about the website. We're going to be using some case studies. I'm going to give you some real life examples of things that have gone on in the world to make the point of some of the things that we're talking about. We're going to understand that we're going to talk a little bit about the implications of what happens when there's unethical behavior and what ethical and professional business practices do to save and promote our business. And again, we're going to be referring back to the Code of Ethics and Standards on the website and where you might be able to find some of those things. So we always talk about our mission statement, which is to promote the interest and growth of the Canadian recruitment and staffing industry. In order to accomplish this, we will identify and communicate and monitor standards in the industry, positively influence and protect the regulatory and business environment that we're members of, that we participate in. We want to promote, this is really important, promote the credibility and visibility of the industry to the business community, to governments, and to the general public. I mean, I don't know how many times in my career I have heard negative news coverage, and they use the word temporary staffing, temporary workers, contract workers in the most derogatory tone and manner. Even during recently in Toronto, while they were talking about some of the nursing shortages, they were criticizing the hospitals for using temporary nurses. Oh my goodness. Temporary nurses saved the hospitals. Temporary nurses saved the emergency departments. Temporary nurses saved our healthcare system through the pandemic. It, as nurses were getting sick and being exposed to the virus and having the same issues, nurses and doctors and other medical professionals were experiencing the same issues you and I were experiencing with our kids home from school and not able to leave the house and get out of the house because we didn't have daycare and coverage, and dealing with our parents and people with disabilities. That getting to work sometimes was an impossibility. And it was the temporary staffing services industry, particularly those that specialized in nurse staffing, that helped save the system. And then all of a sudden, I guess the unions got involved and wanted to make it sound like this was such a terrible thing, such a terrible thing. And because they were obviously negotiating a contract. And so, if we're not in the business of promoting the credibility and visibility of our industry to the business community and to governments and to the general population and to the news media, then of course they're going to constantly be, sorry, forgot to turn the other phone off. They're going to be constantly looking for stories that are not accurate, not true, and don't reflect the value that we contribute to society and to employees who are looking for work and to businesses that are trying to get their job done. So, and again, of course, ACSESS promotes our members through strategic support services, and some of those strategic support services are going to be mentioned today when we talk about professional guidelines. So not to spend a lot of time on the definition of ethics, I think we all know what it is, but it's also known as a moral philosophy. It's a branch of philosophy, ethics, which seeks to address the questions about morality and about the concepts such as good and bad, right and wrong, justice and virtue. And so as we talk about some of these things, we often talk about the characteristics of moral or immoral people or actors or behaviors or companies or conduct. And we hear the words honesty and integrity and accountability and respect and loyalty and fair. We talk about leadership and promise keeping and promise making. We talk about truthfulness and laws. And this, one of the points I want to make today when we talk about business practices and ethics is that in the first few sections that we had together, when we talked about laws, we talked about employment standards, and we talked about pay equity and employment equity and human rights. And very often business actors and people doing the judging, customers and the general public and employees, people who are assessing their satisfaction, they equate abiding by the law, law and order, to be the same as ethics and morality. And of course, in my opinion, the bare minimum of ethics and morality is abiding by the law. So if we only do it because, if we only do certain things, if we only, don't speed, if we only don't drink and drive because we're concerned about getting caught, because there's a law that's punitive, then I'm not really sure if morality is driving and ethics are driving our behaviors. We're driven by the bare minimum laws. And so, we want to take a look at why these laws exist and also try to figure out if this is why the laws exist, is this driving our behavior, or do we have the same sort of driving forces behind our everyday decisions in terms of right and wrong, morality, and how we present ourselves and how we're perceived by others? So doing the right thing and doing the right thing right. Over here on the right-hand side, it says, in 90% of ethical problems we face, we know what we should do. The real question is, are we willing to do the right thing? So Code of Ethics from ACSESS. As members of the Association of Canadian Search, Employment, and Staffing Services, we commit to uphold this Code of Ethics. I've read this quickly in previous sessions to you, Code of Ethics and Standards, and display it prominently in our workplace, in our place of business. We support the principles that are set forth below, and we're going to talk about those 10 principles today and acknowledge that compliance with these principles is in the best interest of all players. And when we talk about all players, we talk about our contract employees, our temporary employees, our internal employees, our owners, our business operators, our customers, our candidates, and our employees who work for us out in the field. And so we're concerned about our client organizations, the reputation of the industry in Canada. So who's responsible for ethical behavior? So here's one of those polls. Sorry. Here's one of those polls that kind of lead us into our first principle. The recruiter, customer, candidate, employee, the recruiter, customer, employee and industry, recruiter, customer, candidate, employee, and access, and who's paying for the invoice? Are they the most responsible for ethical behavior? Is the supplier most responsible for ethical behavior? And the answer is we all play a role in this. And we often have competing, conflicting views because a customer may ask or expect you to do something. And they may ask or expect you to do something in a way that is not consistent with your morals, ethics, with ACSESS guidelines or policies and best business practices. And sometimes our customers or our employees, I had an employee the other day who has been off since before pandemic, who were trying to get to come back to work. And she said she could come back to work, but she's now over 65 and she's collecting old age security and other things. And she said, I'll come back to work for cash because I don't want to affect my other government benefits. And of course, the answer to that was, we would love to have you back, but we can't participate in treating you as an independent contractor when you're really an employee for the sole purpose of not paying the taxes and all the remittances like workers' compensation, employers' health tax, Canada Pension Plan, unemployment insurance that we're required to pay. And, we're going to treat you like an employee. So I think you should talk to your accountant. We thought we should talk to your accountant or your bookkeeper and find a way that if you wish to come back to work and have additional income, that you can do it in a legal way. And, it was kind of really interesting. Like this employee acted in a manner as if she was offended that we wouldn't do something so simple for her and that we were being disrespectful of her and her life. And that's obviously not the case. So that's an example of the kinds of things that happen when people have different views and perspectives and goals and objectives. And so the question is, if you know what's right, are you willing to do what's right? So we're going to go through a bunch of principles that are clearly stated on the ACSESS website, in the ACSESS Code of Ethics and Standards, and in our membership. Principle number 1, we will observe the highest principles of integrity, professionalism, and fair practices in dealing with our clients, candidates, employees of all regulatory authorities, and we will respect the confidentiality of records in accordance with the law and good business practices. So this is the principle number 1, is the high level overarching principle that says we're going to always abide by the law. So some examples just of ethical behavior are things like maintaining promises of confidentiality. It's one thing to say that their information is confidential, but to what effort do you and your organization actually go to protect that promise of confidentiality? Always seeking authorization for disclosure. When we're dealing with candidates and we're talking with customers about our candidates, are we slipping out little bits of information? We had in one of our businesses the other day, we had a customer say, you must give us the temporary workers' personal cell phone number and email address so that we can contact them directly if necessary. And it's a healthcare environment. Of course, they're concerned. They want to have all this information, and they've got some healthcare reasons. If there's been an exposure, they want to do immediate contact and contact tracing. They've got a reason, but it's not reason enough. They could just contact us. They could say, hey, these 5 employees who were here yesterday, they've been exposed to COVID. Inform them, and we could do that. So always So, we went back to the employees and asked them for authorization to disclose it for the purposes of um, contact tracing. And they all said yes. But quite frankly, they should have said no, because I don't trust that the customer is going to always keep. I don't know that a person sitting at the desk isn't going to start emailing people and asking them questions and, ask them to come to work, avoiding us, or give it to another agency or something. I don't know. So, but before you ever hand out that kind of information, any information, we need to seek authorization for disclosure. Knowing and complying with all legislation and regulations, of course, that's what this is all about at a bare minimum. Honoring contractual terms. So knowing your contractual terms is first important. What's in the contract? And then honoring those contractual terms and not allowing some things to slip between the cracks. That's important. Equality, fairness, equity, respect, honesty, and accuracy in our interactions. And when we put in honesty and accuracy in our interactions, we're going to talk more about that in some principles later, which have to do with things like knowing the job description accurately, understanding what is exactly expected of our candidates before we send them to a job, knowing and disclosing to our customers information about our employees that we're sending out an assignment, or candidates that we're sending in for permanent jobs as we're doing our headhunting, not hiding some of that information. So I don't like to spend too much time on the negatives. And by the way, when these over the years, as these presentations continue as CPC modules, we tend to not delete very much from the modules, so they get bigger. But new issues come up, legislation changes, things happen, they get longer. So it becomes more and more difficult to kind of squeeze it into that time session that we have made available for us. But we're going to try to do our best. So examples of some sort of negative things that might happen are the recruiter who created a fake reference and sent it to a client because they couldn't find references or get enough references when filling a job. Well, that would be totally dishonest. Not declaring employee and not making legal deductions from them. So treating people as independent contractors that ought to be treated as employees because they fit all of the criteria of an employee. The recruiter finds out that their client is hiring for a recruiter in-house and submits their own resume for the role. I don't know. Is that illegal? It's not illegal. Is it a violation of a contract? Could be, possibly. Not sure what's in the employee's contract with their employer, with the recruiter's contract with their employer. Not sure what the standard is. So I know I'm thinking about times over the course of my last 40 years when employees didn't do great in the industry and decided they wanted to be in human resources and probably go work with the client. Most of the times, people came and said, hey, I want to go work for this bank, or I want to go work for these people. You got a job I want to apply for. Can I have your blessings? And every time that someone asked, we'd say yes. And most of the time when things like that happened, it turned out great. We had an insider. We had somebody inside the customer's office who respected what we're going through and how we do our work. And they became better, stronger, or at least remained to become good clients. I never had a situation where an employee went to go work for a client and that undermined our relationship. But that's one of those questions. Is this an unethical or immoral behavior? Is it a violation of contract term? Don't know. Lying to a customer regarding absences, lateness, etc. So this is just being forthright with customers about what we know about our candidates and their past performance. Contacting a candidate's former employer for a reference without permission or knowledge. Hey, we're probably going to talk about this later on, but think about the harm that can be done to a candidate if you just assume that their application for employment and the information they wrote on an application form or the information on their resume about where they used to work was implied consent. We talked in our legal aspects last week that implied consent is not a great way to get consent. It's not typically a legal way, an approved way to get consent. So if we were to take a look at the person's last employer and say, oh, I know somebody over there, and call them over and say, what do you think about John or Jane? Where they used to work there. And they go, what do you mean they used to work there? They still work here now. Oops. Now we've just disclosed information that a person is looking for employment, possibly causing irreparable harm to their reputation and to their career with their employer because we made a phone call to an employer about a reference without having specific intent. So here's a question. Your customer, ABC, has an annual spend of $800,000 annually. So they're a pretty big client. I'm going to suggest that they're probably a temporary or contract client, not a perm client if they're spending 800K a year with you, but God bless you if they are on permanent jobs. And they contact you with a 4-month order. So it's temporary work. They indirectly hint that you restrict acceptable candidates on a discriminatory basis. So they're suggesting that they would like people, would prefer people based upon some criteria that are prohibited grounds for discrimination. So in the poll, we say, oh, we'll take all the details and emphasize that you will work hard to provide the best candidate possible based on the required skills while adhering to non-discriminatory practices. Okay, there's a good answer. Ensure you'll get a detailed request in writing so that you can direct blame to them if you get caught. Well, that's not a great answer. That's saying I'm going to do the wrong thing, but I'm not going to be held accountable for it. Hand the assignment to a tenured or more senior recruiter or to your boss who's less uncomfortable with cooperating in discrimination, specifically for a big client. Well, that's not a great solution. I think it's important that you speak to other people about how to handle it. You ask for guidance, that you talk to your manager so your manager knows that this behavior is taking place, but it's not the right answer to just give it to somebody else to let them take the blame and do the wrong thing. Go along with it if the discrimination does not relate specifically to a legally prohibited ground, like physical attractiveness. Yeah. So the only answer is A, take all the details and emphasize to your customer. One of the, I don't know if my answer is a great answer, but I have this conversation several times a year with people where somebody gives us an order and it's obviously discriminatory, whether it's implied discrimination or specific. And somebody brings it to me and says, Steve, do you want to break the news to them? And I end up talking to them. My response to them is, that we can't recruit based upon prohibited grounds, and I know you would not either. And so the types of criteria that you're asking for are probably because in your mind, you think of this type of person as having a certain type of kind of characteristics, predominant, predictable, recurring characteristics. And if you identify that with a particular religion, race, creed, color, age, type of person, that's not necessarily always the case. I mean, those characteristics that you look for that are highly desirable characteristics in the job may be very legal to require people who are hardworking or who are reliable, who show up for work on time, who've got a history of being punctual. And so for us, assuming that a person that fits into a particular group, that they will be or will not be, have those characteristics, is what we want to try to avoid. So let's talk about the characteristics that you're looking for, and then we'll widen the pool to include men or women or people of different religions or people of different creeds, colors, places of origin. We'll include all of those people and make sure that we find you the best qualified person who meets your requirements, but not because they fit into one of those categories, but because they have the characteristics you're looking for. And I think that's better for you. We're not going to be limiting your pool. And most people say, geez, Steve, I didn't mean it to come across like that. That's exactly what we want. And so often dealing with job orders that are based on prohibited grounds are not as difficult as you might think. My screen's not forwarding here, so let's hang on a second. Here we go. So principle number 2, we will provide leadership in the adherence to both the spirit and letter of all applicable human rights, employment laws, and regulations. And we will treat all candidates and employees without prejudice. We will not accept an order from any client that is discriminatory in any way. So the important part of this is not only the intent of the law, but the spirit of the law, because the spirit of the law goes to ethical behavior. And sometimes laws aren't written perfectly and they're not written great. And we're not looking for loopholes in the law. We're looking for ways to accomplish the spirit and intent. So we did this the other day. I'm not going to go over it in detail with you, but these are the areas of what are referred to as prohibited grounds: age, creed, family and marital status, gender identity and gender expression, race and related grounds such as color, ancestry, place of origin, ethnic origin, citizenship. Receipt of public assistance. I didn't talk to you about this one. And this one is almost always related to, they're not all typically related to employment, but almost always related to housing, people wanting to rent an apartment or rent a home. And so, the cases that have arisen have come because the landlord had said this person is on social assistance or receiving some kind of public assistance, and as a result of that, they can't afford to be in our place. But if they use their formula and they applied what's your income to what's your credit rating, how does it apply to this, they possibly may very well be able to afford that housing. So it doesn't often come into an employment area, but it is in the law. Receipt of public assistance is a prohibited ground. Record of offenses, we talked about that. There has to be, if a person has been pardoned or they've reached their statutory term, then these are supposed to be considered offenses that never really happened. We're not supposed to consider those in our selection of people. Sex, and including pregnancy, and sometimes they put sex and pregnancy together. So we don't discriminate against women, we only discriminate against pregnant women. That's inappropriate and illegal. And of course, sexual orientation. The examples, the client requests that we recruit millennials for a role for a designer. The company is a startup and they think or request that young, dynamic people are best for them to work for them. So let's watch out for some of the hidden language, young, dynamic people that would be discriminatory. A client indirectly hints that the recruiter only present female candidates for a front reception role. Of course, we need to address that under gender prohibited grounds. And a client has a role for a forklift driver, and they ask for Brian. There's nothing wrong with asking for the same person back again. There's lots of reasons. You can say, hey, Brian worked here as a forklift driver last month. He was great. He knows our place. He's learned our policies. He's gone through the orientation. He's tried and true. We don't have to retrain him. There's lots of reasons why we can request Brian. And just because Brian is a male, not be accused of being discriminatory in our selection. But if Brian's not available, we'd like another guy like him. That would all then take the request for Brian and add an inappropriate feature to the request. Principle number 3. We will take, so now this is not about what we'll avoid and be aware of, but this is about taking steps. We will take all reasonable steps to provide clients with the accurate information on each candidate's employment qualifications and experience, and we will only present those candidates who have given us authorization to represent their application for employment. I've seen it over and over and over again, where especially with a VMS, where customers have got 10, 20, or 50 suppliers or two, and they put it out to their suppliers electronically. It's an electronic request job order. You've got 24 hours, 2 hours, a deadline, something. There's some rules in how your vendor management system works. And so you just start loading all your resumes in there. And, you think that the one who gets that great resume in there first is going to win the order and fill it, whether it's for a permanent job or a temporary or contract job. It doesn't, just because they're using a vendor management system and it's electronic and speed is of importance, it doesn't alleviate us from our obligations to ask for authorization to represent their application. Now, this particular case, treaty group, in the case study, I was many years ago when this occurred, I was hired as an expert witness by one of the sides, by one of the law firms, to write an expert report on this. And it was really interesting because they didn't use my report because the lawyer found that the information and the positions that I put in my expert report didn't help their client. So I don't, we see this kind of stuff on television all the time about, lawyers representing criminals and companies that are polluting things. And, do they hide information, or do they just select information or present information that suits their narrative? So this was an interesting one because I had very detailed inside information. And basically what happened was this, and I'm not going to read it. I'm going to tell you what happened. The agents, the customer hired a consultant, and the consultant was to help them to develop some business practices and to hire some people. And the consultant said, for this particular job in accounting and back office and administration, let's use an agency. And they helped design the job description and sent it over to and they found an agency and they sent it to the agency. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but the agency didn't send a contract, and the agency didn't send a brochure or anything, but they did have a website that had all of their sort of terms of business, and they promoted themselves by saying, we will do this, we'll background check, we'll screen, we'll test, we'll do all these, and we've got all these branded super awesome ways to do these things, to background check and interview and screen and test. And so some candidates were sent, a candidate was hired. The consultant told the agency during the hiring process, look, you send us the candidates, I'll do the reference checks. So the agency was alleviated of its responsibility legally or contractually, because even though they would normally make a promise that they're going to do that, the customer said, nope, we want to do this. So the person goes to work there. They're in accounts payables and accounts receivables and administration. It's not a great big company. And they treat leather, process leather. And the over time, the employee steals money by writing checks for, I think the story goes, I can't remember exactly, that they put in fake invoices and wrote checks to those invoices and then deposited those checks into their own bank account. And so over time, little bits of money were stolen until it added up to lots, over $100,000 in stolen money. And so when the person was terminated for other reasons, it came to their attention when they were doing some audits that this money had been stolen, and they were able to establish who stole it and where it went. So they sued the employment agency for failure to meet their obligations under the contract. And so the agency didn't have a contract. They only had industry standards to rely upon. And they had a website where they made generic promises to all their customers about the things that they would do. And they had some emails back and forth between this consultant saying things like, don't worry about it, we'll do the reference check. Well, it turns out that the agency knew, or ought to have known, based upon their conversations with the candidate's previous employers, that this person had been fired for reasons of dishonesty. And they either started to find out that it was a bad reference and stopped pursuing it, or they knew it was a bad reference and they never documented it or passed it along. And they let the client fail based upon the fact that the client said, don't worry, we'll do the references. And I guess they said, well, if the client doesn't find out that this person's a stealer, then, our hands are clean. So then they didn't settle, it went to court. The agency originally, the client originally won the case, for breach of contract, for failure to comply with some minimal industry standards that were implied. And so you very often have um, laws will exist and standards will exist if they're reasonable and if they're implied and if they're in common law. And decisions have been made around these things before. And so then the agency appealed it, and they appealed it based upon the fact that the client had said that they would do the references. And what happened from that is they said, look, you still lose, but we will take that into consideration when we calculate the damages and how much you need to pay them. And the original payment was a lot over $100,000 in the loss and the return of the fees. And then the modified under appeal was lower. And then when it came down to costs, they didn't have to pay each other's costs. And so this was one of those nasty cases where, somebody won, but they won nothing, that they weren't able to establish how much it cost them, prove it goes back to the agency. And so sometimes it's okay to be right, but if you can't prove how much, and then it doesn't really matter. And in this particular case, both parties failed in terms of dealing with contract law, employment law, and integrity. So the agency ought to have known or did know and seemed to hide it. They didn't do all the things that were typical of an employment agency when doing a permanent placement. And in terms of background checking, interviewing, screening, and disclosure of information. And they all failed in terms of having written contracts and following through with them properly. So that's the story of Leather Treaty. And I'm trying to get my computer to move forward. So some examples of what not to do. We don't want to make up references or ignore the unfavorable ones. We don't want to alter or fail to disclose unfavorable test scores. We don't want to avoid seeking out approval from a candidate. So if we think the candidate has maybe applied for that job directly, or some other agency submitted it, just say, hey, let's just stick that resume in there anyways. Maybe we can get paid for it if they get the job. We don't want to falsify any information whatsoever. So missing a step can be risky business. It can turn into a lawsuit. It can turn into a liability. And so we don't want to skip steps or ignore steps or falsify information in steps. Principle number 4, we'll supply candidates and employees with complete and accurate information as provided by the client. Hey, this one is a big one. It happens whether it's a permanent placement, executive search, recruitment, contract, temporary. Clients don't always disclose to us why that job's available. They don't always tell us exactly what the job description is. And quite frankly, and no disrespect to some human resources folks, but particularly in large organizations, the folks in human resources don't always exactly know what the person does in their job over in that other department, in another building, in another location. They've got this templated job description that was written 5 years ago that fits into some agreement or fits into some kind of standard. But what the person actually does from day to day sometimes is very different from the job description that the human resources person or department manager provides to the recruiter. So asking questions, seeking out accuracy, telling candidates, I don't know. When you don't know, it's okay to say, I didn't really get a good answer on that. I'm not sure. Maybe you should explore that part during your interview instead of getting it caught off guard. So, trying to get information from customers and disclose that information to your candidates before they go is pretty important. So here's a case. We placed an employee at our client as a data entry operator for Beta alphanumeric data entry. Then they contact the employee a few weeks later after the person started on the job to find out that they're not only doing just straight old data entry, they're also using MS Project in Excel. They're creating pivot tables and they're running analysis and reports weekly on charts for their employer or for the supervisor. So this job is far more senior and it requires far more skills than was originally anticipated. So what should the recruiter do? I don't know. I mean, this is where we would have a discussion, right? Is your company the kind of company that charges a higher fee for a more sophisticated job like this? And so what's the wrong? Is the wrong that you should have charged more money in the placement fee or in the temporary hourly rate? Is it that your company has very specific standards about pay rates, that employees doing this would normally get paid $25 an hour, not $19 an hour? And so you're now violating one of your company policies by not paying people according to your established pay scales, that this is for some reason you've exploited and taken advantage of the customer through a lack of information or for specific intent. Is it that you just don't like it, that you feel like the candidate is being exploited and taken advantage of, that they found a person who would take a lower pay rate and then gave them more jobs to do? I think that this would definitely be the case if you said, hey, this is only lifting 15 pounds, but when they get there, the person has to lift 45 or 150 pounds, or this person doesn't have to can go home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they constantly keep them overtime. I don't know if hiring a person for a job and then finding out that they're capable of doing more and expanding their skills on their skills is an unethical thing. It really goes back to, what's the issue? What was the intent? How did this come about? Was it because of something that was unethical or immoral, or did you just happen to hire a person who turns out to be a superstar? And so I guess the next question is, if they are turning out to be a superstar and are doing a different job, are you paying them appropriately so that your employment equity, pay equity, all of your equality policies are being adhered to? Principle number 5: we will not recruit, encourage, or entice a candidate whom we have previously placed to leave the employ of our client. Nor will we encourage or coerce an individual to leave any temporary assignment before stated completion dates. So the first part of this one deal with permanent placements, with search, recruitment, and placement, that we've charged a fee to the client to place them, and maybe there's a guarantee, maybe there's not, maybe they've been there for a while, but we typically call this an anti-rating clause that is included in a contract. And there's some implied common law around this, that if you are paid a fee to solve a problem for the customer, i.e., find the appropriate candidate and present them and help them hire that candidate into the job, then they pay you a fee. It would be wholly unethical for you to say, okay, 3 months have gone by, or 6 weeks have gone by, or 6 months have gone by, or years gone by, that's a perfect candidate for another job, and then go back and knowingly and intentionally cause harm to that customer, undoing the benefit that you provided to them in exchange for a fee, only because you had the knowledge, the confidential information that existed, and you had a duty to make sure that what you did was right, a fiduciary duty to make sure you did what was right. And so knowingly and intentionally taking an action that would cause harm to your customer in a manner that would not have occurred but for the knowledge that and experience you had from servicing them and getting paid to service them in the past. So anti-rating is one of the nastiest things that a recruiter in the industry can do. And I can pretty much assure you that if a recruiter in the industry gets a reputation for rating on their placements, that they're not likely to last in the industry for a long time. The second part of that principle has to do with temporary workers. So we've got a temporary worker. So it says, nor will we encourage or coerce an individual to leave any temporary assignment before the stated completion date. So this is a temporary worker who's on your assignment or maybe on a competitor's assignment. So we're going to come back to an example about what happens when you know of a person who's got great skill and you want to recruit them to come and work for your client, but they're working for another agency on a temporary assignment. So under what circumstances would you entice a candidate or employee who has been previously placed at your client site to take another role you were working on? And the answer is none, really. Um, you know, here's an interesting thing. Let's look at, you can read A, B, and C. Um, you don't recruit people you've previously placed for any reason whatsoever. But let's take a look at D. When the client is planning layoffs sometime in the future. So you've placed a person into a job. The candidate phones you up and says, "Oh my goodness, you placed me here a year ago. The place is coming down. There's a problem. I'm hearing rumors now that they're going to be laying people off, and I'm last in, first out. I'm probably going to get laid off. Can you help me find another job? I want to get on top of this and get ahead of this before um, I'm left standing here and without a job." And the answer is no, I can't. I'm legally obliged to not do that. Of course, if they lay you off, I because you're in a layoff position and expected to return to work, if they give you a return to work date, we probably should have to ask for permission then too. But if you if you're having a conversation with your client and the client says, "Yeah, no, we're not going to be giving you any new orders for the next little while. We're anticipating we're doing some layoffs. We're trying to figure out who that is." There's absolutely nothing wrong for you to say, "Hey, we've placed some people there before. Is it helpful to you, if you're going to lay them off, for us to get ahead of it with them and help them find another job? We might be able to alleviate any severance pay cost to you because they might find another job before their layoff is over. Do you want us to work with some of these candidates, some of these employees, if your intent is to lay them off?" And they might say, "Yeah, we are." And then you can enter into in a collaborative way and um, possibly under an open, honest, transparent way, you can be of benefit to the employee and to your customer. So this is where we get this screen. Let's play nice in the sandbox, how agencies and clients can work by winning together. So let's have a discussion about a couple things. Recruiter needs to fill an order, another role ASAP, and the margin is higher. The recruiter wants to pull an employee from a national account where the profit margins are very low so that they can place them into their new order where the profit margins are higher. And the answer to that is no, don't do that. When we've placed a person into an assignment, the implication is, if it's not specifically written in the contract, that we will not do something to cause harm to the client in a way that comes as a result of the fact that we could possibly earn money somewhere else. Now, none of these things are straightforward. They're not always cut and dry. I'm going to give you an example in one of my other businesses, in the home care businesses, which is kind of like a temporary help business. It's not. Um, it's very similar to a home care business. So imagine that I have got two clients, both that are bedridden with serious health issues, seniors at home, and they need 24-hour care. And this client, A, has got a team of 5 or 6 people that is looking after them. And they, all have their shifts, and they all work their 40-hour shifts, and we're able to cover each other when somebody goes on vacation or someone's sick or has an issue at home. The other 4 or 5 caregivers can go into place. And so the client's not too concerned about whether or not, employee number 1 works in shift number 1, employee number 2 works in shift number 2. What the client's concerned about is having constant care from people that they're familiar with. And then over here, we've got another client who has got 4 or 5 caregivers with very similar needs, except for 3 of them are off sick or away, or their children are sick, or something happens. So we take one of the caregivers from this client and bring them over for a shift to look after this client, because the first client has got a backup team that can cover for them. So we took somebody out of this scheduled appointment and put them into that scheduled appointment. But here's the thing. So you say, oh, well, Steve, if you follow the recommendations that will not recruit or take a person out of an assignment for a more profitable for some other kind of assignment, here's the thing. It might be more profitable to not allow hours to go unfilled. But this is overall providing the same level of service in an indiscernible way, not causing any harm whatsoever to the first, possibly saving the life of the second. So we can find circumstances where the conditions are perfectly fine to kind of move people around. But the implication is here in this particular question is that we've placed somebody into ABC, super large company that's got hundreds of temporary workers there with a very low margin, and that we're not happy with that low margin. So we're going to start pulling people out of there and put them into a more profitable place. That's pretty clear, cut and dry. In example number 2, the employee tells you that they have another opportunity and they want to leave the assignment. That is, yeah, like that happens all the time. We have employees, whether or not they're internal recruiters, whether they're people who work in our accounting department, or whether they're temporary workers or contractors that we sent out on assignment, and they come to us and say, hey, look, I got to give you notice and I'm going to quit. So the first question is, are we paying the person properly? Are we treating them well? Is there something that we can do to counter offer or work with this person to keep them in their assignment? Is that something that you want to do? If you want to do that, are you going to be paying them appropriately and with equality and fairly? Are you being honest to them that you can sustain that payment to them or those promises to them over the long term? That you're not going to make false promises to them so that they don't take the new opportunity. But in and of itself, an employee who says to you, hey, I got to go. I found another job. There's nothing unethical about that. It would be unethical if they didn't give you any notice. It would be unethical if they took things when they left. It would be unethical if they went to go work for a competitor and intended to use confidential information to work for the competitor. But the fact that the employee tells you that they've got an opportunity and they're leaving their assignment in and of itself is not an unethical behavior. In example number 3, recruiter locates a candidate who is currently working for a competitor. I said I'd bring this up again. On a 3-month assignment, they would be perfect for your job order, and your job order pays more money. So you know of a candidate who's maybe even worked for you before. They're now working for a competitor in a 3-month assignment, and you would like them to come back and work for you. But in order to do that, they need to leave their order early. Well, if you follow the ACSESS Code of Ethics and Standards, it says we will not recruit a person from an existing order. The intent and spirit and purpose of that is that if we could do anything to not cause harm to our reputation, and if we are knowingly causing harm to a customer, to anybody's customer, or to the reputation of one of our competitors, that we're acting in a malicious intent, using a competitive advantage to take that person out of that job, that is inappropriate. In the normal course, a person were to say, hey, I took a 3-month assignment. I've been here for 2 months. I'm going to leave 2 weeks early. I'm going to give them 2 or 3 weeks notice that I'm leaving early. I'm going to comply with the terms of my contract. That in and of itself is not an unethical behavior. But if you got a choice and you hire and place somebody who's in your roster without causing harm to anyone, knowingly causing harm to anyone, that's the ethical and appropriate thing to do. If you are going to hire people, you can't, you're never going to say, I'm not going to hire this person because I promised I won't hire people. The question is, am I knowingly and willingly and intentionally causing harm to my company's reputation or to an industry participant's, to a competitor's reputation, when we could have otherwise conducted our business in a manner that didn't knowingly and intentionally cause harm to people? Which doesn't mean there aren't circumstances where a person can't follow the terms of their agreement, give notice to leave a job, act appropriately, and everything works out okay. Click. There we go. Principle number 6. By the way, we're going to take a break at 2:30. That's 1:59. So we've got 30 more minutes before we get to our 10-minute break. Principle number 6. We will not restrict the right of a candidate or employee to accept employment of an offer of any choice. So here's so the last conversation, if by not offering something to somebody that we know to be really good for them, is that restricting the right of a candidate to accept employment of their choice? If we've got, but this is really intended to deal with the temporary worker that you put, or contract worker that you put out on an assignment, and the customer wants to hire them, or they want to apply for an internal job. And the principle goes like this. If we have a contract with a customer that says that they'll pay us a fee because they hired one of our candidates, because we hired one of their candidates that we sent there on a temporary assignment, then that agreement is between us and the client. And the fact that the candidate goes there and finds out about the job, wants to apply the job, we should not unfairly restrict that person from applying, having the freedom to apply for the job that they want. If it so happens that the customer has to pay us a fee because that's the agreement, that's between us and the client. By threatening the candidate, telling them they can't do it, that's inappropriate. The second part of this is that understand that in some provinces, like in Ontario, the law says that from 6 months from the first date that we introduced that person on a temporary assignment, regardless of how many hours they worked, how many weeks they worked, but 6 months from the date that we first sent them there on a temporary assignment, after 6 months has gone by, we cannot even legally charge them a fee. So we can go to the client at the end of 4 months and say, hey, I understand you're going to hire this person. You know, we're not going to stop them from accepting the job. That's their right to do that. Know that, you know, based upon our contract, you're going to end, if you hire them, our invoice will come out the door for $1,000 or $2,000 or $500 or whatever the number is, for the balance of the 2 months to buy out that contract. And if you keep them on the temporary assignment and make them a promise to start in 2 months from now, there's no fee. So you can be open and honest and transparent and communicate. You can apply by the law. But the important thing is that you do not ever say to a candidate, you can't take that job, because that's not your right to do that. And there's typically and usually with an employee. Now, if it's an independent contractor, that's a different thing. That's competition between two companies. And so you introduce one company to your client to perform a service. And if they use the information that was provided to them, that you paid to them, as a way to undercut you and circumvent you, that's contract law. That's a different thing entirely. We're talking about employees accepting an offer of employment. True or false, the company agency you work for has just experienced 90% turnover in their branch and needs to recruit. But ACSESS has an association chapter meeting coming up, and you can attend and let everyone know that you have immediate positions available. This is an unacceptable method of recruitment. The answer is yes, because the principle says that we will not misuse our membership privileges, which is knowing who all of the other members are and being invited to members-only events for the purpose of recruiting other member staff, or in a way that may otherwise injure our candidates, employees, or competitors. So there's nothing wrong with hiring people from within the industry. The principle says, if you want to hire people from the industry, do it in the way that you normally do it. Don't pay a membership fee, get a list, go to a chapter meeting, use that information that was given to you in confidence with the understanding that you were all going to go there together for the betterment of the industry, and then knowingly cause harm to your competitors. So post an ad, put up a sign, do, let everybody know through word of mouth, put it on your social media, but do not attend a member event or use a member list and say, let's use this member list and start a conference participant list and start recruiting people that are there, that is tantamount to the breach of contract for confidential information, in using confidential information in a manner that caused harm to the other party and used in a way that it was not intended to be used. Principle number 8, we will derive income only from clients and make no direct or indirect charges to candidates or employees unless otherwise specified. So we talked about this during the legal aspects for recruitment. And we said in common law, there are all kinds of cases where it would be inappropriate and illegal to charge a candidate to find a job and masking that by charging them to redo their resume or to do a video or to help them with something or to give them a training or do a boot camp on job search. That would be inappropriate. We recommend to all employment agencies and staffing services, don't try to make money for your candidates. So first off, it's got a bad look. Secondly, in common law, it's found to be illegal. And finally, in some provinces like Ontario, the Employment Standards Act, through the modifications in 2013 in the Employment Standards Act, were modified to make it illegal for an employment agency to charge employees or candidates any money for helping them find a job. And so we talk about, do you have a resume writing business? Even if you had the business next door, and you sent them over to the business next door and said, we'll charge you $200 to help you redo your resume. Even if you found a legal loophole to do that, the look is terrible. So it's not only that we follow the law, but we understand the spirit, intent, and principle of the law as we go forward. Because following the law is simply the bare minimum standard, complying with the imagination of the person who helped write that law, who probably didn't really understand anything about temporary help, contract work, and employment agencies. So the spirit and intent is what is really all that matters. Principle number 9, we will maintain the highest standards of integrity in all forms of advertising and communication and solicitation, and we'll conduct our business in a manner designed to enhance the operation, image, and reputation of employment, recruiting, and staffing services industry as a whole. So basically it's saying advertise honestly. Let's try not to disparage the reputations of our competitors when we put things in writing. Remember that when you put it on the internet, it's there forever. If it goes on your website, if it goes into a job posting, if it goes into a brochure, if it goes out somewhere in an email, then these need to be open and honest and transparent. Now, there's nothing illegal about being an idiot. So if you run jobs and post them on the internet or on job boards or on your company website that are littered with spelling, punctuation, and grammar mistakes, then you're doing harm to your company, doing harm to your industry, doing harm to your personal reputation, and you're probably not going to be that effective at finding very good candidates. I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at the types of terrible job postings that people put up. The answer is 10. That, having grammatical errors, ABC company is looking for a senior editor with an eyes for detail. Let's be careful, because what you do and how you approach things on the internet and in social media and on job boards and on your website has a lasting effect on your reputation. So let's talk a little bit about social media before we move on to our break and the final principle. When do you use social media at work? Well, you know what? In the recruitment and staffing industry, the answer should be every day, all day. I mean, great recruiters, I don't know how many millions of people and thousands and thousands of first level contacts I have in LinkedIn. But your jobs and what you do probably should be posted on LinkedIn. You should have a company um, page on LinkedIn. You should have a company page on Facebook. You should have a company Twitter account. You should have an integration between your job postings and all these social media sites. You should be using your personal Facebook account in a way that you can help remind everybody in the world of what you do, where you work, and how that they can make referrals to you. If you want to be successful, you really should be taking advantage of groups on Facebook and groups in LinkedIn, and you should be figuring out how to put postings on Instagram and Twitter in order to promote yourself, your company, your jobs, what you do. Some people choose not to. Some people to have a personal account, choose to have a personal account and to have a corporate account. Um, but how you use social media in your personal life and how you use it at work will affect you. It'll affect your career. It'll affect your company. And so be mindful that your postings will be available to the general public. So if you've got a position on truckers in Ottawa and it's on your social media account, and you on your social media accounts tell everybody what you do, then maybe it's time to just say, hey, this could cause harm to me. This could cause harm to my industry. This could cause harm to my employer. Sometimes say nothing is better said than saying something. Remember that once you post something on the internet, it's there forever. You can delete things, but there's all kinds of services and all kinds of ways for people to know what you posted yesterday or 2 weeks ago or today. And the edit button ain't going to help Elon Musk that much, because anything that's ever been put up there can be found again. Be respectful, be truthful, honor privacy rights. I don't think it's in here, but there's a great case that took place in Mississauga not too many years ago at a car dealership where a salesperson was required to come and flip hamburgers at a barbecue event for an open house on a Saturday. And that conflicted with his social plans. And so he posted some pretty nasty comments about his employer requiring him to work on a Saturday as a commissioned salesperson. And of course, it made it to social media, and the gentleman lost his job because he was posting pictures of him there on Saturday at work and talking specifically about his employer on social media. So, sometimes the lines aren't too gray. Sometimes they're pretty hard drawn in the sand. And so that was an example of the car dealership employee in Mississauga who worked on a Saturday and used Facebook to post pictures of him making faces and flipping burgers into I think something happened also there, and he posted it. He behaved badly at work that day and posted it on the internet also. Express your own opinions. For example, the views expressed on this website, weblog, are mine alone and do not necessarily reflect the views of my employer. Well, that's a pretty good idea. That's a pretty good idea as a general disclaimer. But in my opinion, we ought to then also give serious consideration to what we're going to put there anyways. And so the disclaimer for the views on this website are mine and mine alone, and don't reflect the views of my employer, is there when you make a mistake and you could not have or should not have or did not anticipate how that could have caused harm to your employer, that any reasonable person would not have anticipated that would cause harm. So this kind of disclaimer helps you with that. But let's go one level up and say, let's anticipate whether it will cause harm. Now, in Ontario, just recently, last week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, legislation came into effect that is the Electronic Monitoring Act. So this is not the same, but similar, because this says that employers are allowed to monitor when you're using company equipment, when you're on the company internet and intranet, when you're using company websites, when things post to social media, that they are allowed to monitor you. so long as they have a policy that's written and tell you how you're being monitored. So the laws are not going more in favor of privacy. The laws are going more in favor of disclosure when it comes to social media and employees using social media at work. So never disclose confidential information, proprietary or commercial or sensitive information in social media for the same reason I said before. Once it's posted there, it's there forever. Ensure your conduct outside the workplace would be acceptable in the workplace. Hey, I'm going to give you a example also, from my own previous work. We had an employee working for us who posted provocative postings, and of provocative postings that were not in keeping with our corporate standards of ethics and morality and integrity. And it turned out that the employee thought and was mistaken that the sites that they were using were more private, but they had not properly set the settings to ensure their privacy, that those pictures would not come in the public domain. So it came to our attention. Somebody complained about it. Our first step was to go to the employer and say, are you aware of the fact that these things are available in the public domain? And then the person was shocked and appalled and embarrassed, and took the initiative to figure out how to, I don't know whether remove them or change their privacy settings, but there are ways to go ahead and approach things also. So again, it was not the employee's spirit or intent to knowingly post things on the internet that would cause, or should do, or ought to have known would cause harm to their employer and to their reputation and to our reputation. And so open honesty, transparency, written policies, and we did have a written policy that spoke very clearly about what was not permitted and what our authority was in terms of our ability to act on it. And so that was all handled, very bad situation, handled well. Principle number 10, before we go for our break, we're going to break a little bit earlier. We will recognize and respect the rights and privileges of competitors in the true fashion of individual initiative and free enterprise, and we will refrain from engaging in acts of unfair competition. So again, this has to deal with mostly, I think originally had a lot to deal with employment agencies and staffing companies recruiting employees from their competitors for the sole or explicit intent of getting their customers. So the employee works in a successful desk in a company, or maybe not successful, but they have got access to and have responsibility for looking after customers. They have access to knowledge, customer lists, who does business with whom. And so recruitment company B says, come and work for us. We'll pay you a premium. We'll give you this. We're really nice. It's closer to home, whatever their selling features were. But in exchange for that, you need to bring those customers with you. Now, here's an interesting thing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this before we go to break. I don't mean to always use Ontario, but we've talked about this before. Very often, Ontario is one of the leading provinces in terms of codifying laws, which doesn't mean they're leading in laws. Very often, laws are just established in other provinces, are often established first in other provinces. But Ontario tends recently, for the last 10 or 15 years, to say, hey, if judges have decided this, if it's become common in common law, if there's been decisions about this thing, let's just write it into the statute. Let's just go to the legislature, put it into the Employment Standards Act, or write it into our Privacy Act, or get it into our Human Rights Act, and put it in writing for people so they don't have to rely upon, is this clear, or is this the same as the previous lawsuit, and has that precedent affected this decision today? So they go ahead and say, look, let's just take this principle, let's write it right into the law. Now, many of these laws are first decided in British Columbia and Alberta and Saskatchewan and Quebec and in eastern provinces. It's It's not that Ontario is better at making laws. It's that Ontario tends to have more of a tendency, tends to move quickly towards codifying it into a statute. So in Ontario, it is written into the law passed by the current government that it is illegal to restrict a person from having a non-competition clause in their employment agreement. So let's talk about non-competition clauses for a second and what this principle is really all about. We recognize and respect the rights and privileges of competitors in a true fashion, and we will not, and free enterprise, and we will refrain from engaging in acts of unfair competition. So it is not illegal to restrict a person from using confidential information. When it's private, confidential information, it is not illegal. It is well within the law to have an employment agreement and in common law to say, this is proprietary, this is ours, we paid for it, we paid you a salary or commission or money to look after it, to use it and care for it. And now that we've paid you to look after it, use it and care for it, if you're going to steal that information in your mind or in your photocopier or a scanner or a photograph, if you're going to steal that information, and Justice Wyuschuk said, the memorization of information and the use of it is tantamount to the physical asportation, to the physical theft of that information. So if you got a good memory and you can read something, memorize a customer's name and telephone number and the price you charged them, then, and you would not have had access to that information in the public domain, then memorizing it is the same as stealing it. So there's no restrictions on, and nothing against the law. It's totally within the law to have terms in your agreement and in common law that would stop people from using proprietary, confidential information. There is also nothing wrong with restricting a person from violating confidential information and their fiduciary duty, which would go to things like recruiting your coworkers to come work for your competitor. So you leave a job, and after you go, you say, hey, while I was there, I'm going to rephrase this so you understand what we're saying. When I was there for the last 2 years, I was paid a salary and commission to get to know who the 3 best recruiters were. I was paid a salary and commission to nurture and develop relationships of trust and confidence with those coworkers so that we could collaborate together to serve the customers of the company. And I want to use that information and those relationships that I was paid to have in a way to now steal those people, cause harm to my previous employer for my personal benefit or for the benefit of my future employer. So that is referred to as a fiduciary duty. And a fiduciary duty in law is really a duty or responsibility that you were paid to have and hold, to care for something on behalf of the employer. And the example that I like to use is the nanny who was paid to nurture and develop a relationship of trust and confidence for the safety and benefit of a child, for the mother and father's child. And the nanny was paid to look after them. But the nanny developed such a wonderful relationship with the child when she's at work, that when she goes to leave, she steals the child and takes it away with her. Well, in law, that's pretty clear. That's kidnapping. And it's wrong, and it's unethical, and it's inappropriate. And I can use that example to establish what the most extreme case of fiduciary duty means, but it also means information. It also means customers. It also means relationships. If a person is paid in a salary and commission and bonuses and given a job description and they receive that money in exchange for holding and having and maintaining relationships of trust and confidence and information, and then they leave and use that information in a manner that causes harm to their previous employer for the unfair benefit of the person or the person's new employer, that is contractual tortious interference. It's contractual breach of fiduciary duty. It's contractual breach of confidential information. So we've got this notion of confidential information, fiduciary duty, proprietary information, um, you know, patents and copyrights. We've got all of these well-established concepts in law. And so what companies did in the past, say, boy, that's a lot to write down. That's a lot to describe. That's a lot to, so if we just stop the person from competing with us, then that covers everything. If we give them a not, thou shalt not work in the industry, in the, province or in the country or in the general area for the next 2 years, that should cover all of the notions of misuse of confidential information, fiduciary duty, proprietary information, copyrights, patents, trademarks. That a competition clause is like a blanket to throw all of those things. And the courts have said, so now the courts have said, and the Ontario government has specifically said in statute, you can't use that non-competition blanket to deal with those issues. If somebody goes to work for a competitor and they don't steal your information, then they can go work for a competitor. If a company goes work for a competitor and they don't unfairly violate some notion of fiduciary duty or confidential information, they can go work for your competitor. So the blanket for non-competition no longer exists, but all of the notions that it was put in intent for still do. So recruiting from a competitor to get access to their customers and their confidential information would be inappropriate, which doesn't mean you can't hire people that worked for competitors. It means you can't hire people who work for your competitors and expect them to give you access to confidential information. Discussing prices and business terms with competitors during a bid is considered price fixing and inappropriate. So you know that when you're doing an online bid or a bid for a customer, they have you go into the silent zone, the quiet zone. As soon as the bid is put out, you're not allowed to talk to your customer or the contact or the person in purchasing or procurement or human resources about the bid. You're not allowed to go to a meeting and collaborate with your customers to tell them what you're pricing and what they're pricing so that you can price fix together. So these things are all covered under competition legislation. There's another notion that this fair competition was called tortious interference for a thing called workforce transfer. And this has to deal with the circumstances when a staffing company has a contract with a customer for a term, say a 3-year term. The term's coming to an end. Everybody knows it comes to an end. It's going to end November 30th. December 1st, a new contract is going to exist. It's going to exist with the same supplier, with a new supplier, but they're going to bid and they're doing an evaluation and they're going to figure out who wins and the new contract is going to come out. So the question is, if you lose, number one, in the process, during the bid process, is the existing supplier threatening the customer, saying, we will pull all of our employees and not allow them to work with you or stay with you or transfer to another company. We will sue you. We will cause harm to you. We will cause your business to fail. If we don't get this contract, everybody goes. Well, that wasn't the terms of the contract. The terms of the contract was it ended on a particular date. And how you put in the contract what would happen after that date was really up to the contract. But it never really ever intended the fact that, and if you do business with somebody else, we will hurt you. So there's that one thing. The second situation is during the leading up to the contract renewal and the bid process, did another supplier come in and say, for example, human resources or department manager or procurement, and say, hey, by the way, if you give me all of the information about the temps and contractors that are on assignment. If you force them or in some way encourage them to transfer to come work for me, I'll give you a favorable price when the contract comes up. Because I know that the existing company is charging you $30 an hour and they're making X number of dollars. But if you give me all the info and I don't have to recruit anybody, and you force or encourage or entice those people to come work for us, threaten them with reprisals or loss of job or something, I can give you $1 decrease because I'm not going to incur the cost that the other company incurred in order to find all those people and to place them there. So that would be considered tortious interference. It would be interfering with and using confidential information that you never would have had access to, but for the client participating with the new supplier to give information that they never had the right to give and causing irreparable harm to the outgoing company. And so the third scenario in a workforce transfer. So the first one was, are the outgoing suppliers, the current supplier threatening their customer? They'll cause harm to them because the customer's contract is legally coming to end. The second situation was a new competitor comes in and asks for access to all of the information and the relationships so that they can win the contract and unfairly compete. And the third one is after a fair competition, if the current supplier loses the contract and then interferes with the employee's right to choose whether they would like to pursue work with the new supplier or pursue work with the client, would be a violation of a access policy because we always give the person the right to choose who their employer would be. So we want to stop. We don't want to threaten people before. We don't want to use confidential information before to entice or encourage or penalize people. And then finally, after a fair competition is again to step number 3, we don't want to restrict the right of people now that a new decision has been made fairly, openly, and honestly. A new decision made, we're not going to restrict the rights of people to choose where they go to work and who they work for. One of the other reasons why this particular 10th principle was put in place, it had to do with what we call a multiple submission. And that's where an example would be, and I hate giving terrible examples of bad things, but that would be, say, for example, a candidate comes in for an interview with you, with a recruiter. They say, yeah, I gave authorization to ABC company to submit my resume yesterday to XYZ client for the job of this. And you go, wow, I know somebody over at XYZ company. I'm going to submit your resume to XYZ company, hoping that they ignore ABC's submission of you and that they give priority to this. So here we've got a person and a candidate disclosing information for transparency, and the receiver of the information is using it in a way that might actually turn out into the candidate not getting the job at all, because the customer is going to go, boy, this is messy, or boy, this person violated some confidential information or something. So using information to knowingly multiple submit a candidate would be inappropriate. And then having contract terms that people said that they would comply with, if it turns out later on that you didn't like those terms, that you were naive in or made a judgment mistake in terms of signing those contract terms, changing your mind is that's what this principle is designed for. There's a thing called abusive market dominance, which has to do with the Competitions Act. It's federal legislation. It's used rarely. It's designed for companies that dominate a market. They've got the majority of the business, and that they can intentionally use money or intentionally threaten suppliers or intentionally threaten users in a way to stop them from using new suppliers. And so it's called abusive market dominance. And that typically is not something that happens in the staffing industry, but that could be extended if we get into price fixing with 2 or 3 big suppliers on, say, for example, federal government or provincial government contracts. The last one before we go has to deal with, and this one is really innocuous. So in the last screen, I really talked about some serious stuff. This one has to deal with, a candidate walks into your office and is applying for a job that you don't typically fill. How do you handle it? Do you pretend that you handle it and just let them go by the wayside? Do you tell them, hey, check our website all the time? You never know. Something like that might come up and you can remind us that you're available. We'll watch for you, but it's not something we do. You could even say, hey, why don't you head over to ABC company to, I happen to know that, this one of my competitors has a contract to do exactly that. And I don't do that. So why don't you go down there? Here's the name of somebody I know. They're really great. See if you can go get them to help you find a job. The answer is you can do all of these things. The question just is it open? Is it transparent? Is it helpful? Is it honest? And away we go. 10 principles, there are 11. We will ensure that our clients, candidates, and employees are aware of our duty to abide by the Code of Ethics and Standards and such supporting policies and guidelines as may be from time to time be adopted by the association. And we will undertake to bring any potential infringements before the appropriate association body. So this is basically saying we recognize all the previous 10 commitments, and if we know of violations, we'll do something about it. We will contact ACSESS. We'll make them aware of it. We won't just turn a blind eye. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with respect to this one. It's pretty straightforward. We already covered it. This one has to deal with the customer who wants table greeters at a conference, and that they're going to wear a uniform of blouse and skirt. And of course, the example that I gave earlier is a perfect example to say, hey, I can't really put blouse and skirt in there because that implies you're only hiring women. That we can have white tops and black bottoms. Is that correct? And they go, yep, that's for sure. And so now we've just removed any of the implied discrimination on prohibited grounds of gender. So we talked about doing the right thing, and that it can sometimes be expensive. The question isn't that we usually don't know what the right thing is. The question is, are we willing to do the right thing? Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute break. It is now 2:36. We'll give you 14 minutes. Let's get back at 2:45. Let's come back here. No, 9 minutes. Let's come back here at 2:45, and we'll zoom through the last part of our presentation for today. I'm going to put my screen on quick break today. Hopefully everyone is back at their desk. I'm going to move along. We're going to move now through, we've dealt with the 10 principles, and the 11th principle telling us that we will abide by the first 10 principles. We're going to move on to business practices and operating guidelines and some parts of managing your business that are important in this session. I got to get my screen to change. Here we go. Industry guidelines. There's a section on the ACSESS website that's available to members. Now, I'm going to remind you, if you are here and you do not have your own account on the ACSESS website to get access to the members only portion of the ACSESS website, please reach out to Jennifer and let her know that you would like a username and password, and that you will be able to access things like industry guidelines. And we're going to talk about some of those. These are some of the things that over the years ACSESS said, hey, these are recurring issues that come up all the time, and people always come to us for guidance. And so one of them is workforce transfer, which I talked to you about in detail already. I'm not going to go over that a lot again. Providing service during a labor dispute. This one has to deal with when your customer goes on strike. And I'm going to go off the top of my head in terms of what's in that guideline. I think I wrote it years ago. The answer is you can provide people to your customer when they're on strike, so long as, number one, you're not unfairly intervening or influencing the outcome of the normal process of labor negotiations. There's lots of law around how companies are supposed to and unions are supposed to abide by the labor code in their negotiations, who's allowed to sign a card, who's allowed to vote, who it includes. And by all means, if your temporary workers sign a card to be a member of the voting group in a situation where someone's trying to unionize, they can black box or set those aside, and they can go to court and ask a judge, are these temporary workers typically in a situation where they've got the same long-term vested interest as the other employees to participate or not? And so if you had temps that were there for one day and they signed a card, probably the judge would say, no, they don't really have long-term vested interest in this. And if they're there for long-term, and some of those temps are using temp to perm as a method to hire, the judge is likely to say yes. And so we want to make sure that we don't intervene in a way that unfairly influences the outcome of the negotiations, of the fair and free negotiations. The second thing is, we do not want to ever knowingly put our temporary workers and contractors at physical or emotional risk of harm or harassment. And so is it a safe place? Are they allowed to cross the picket line? Or is there protection where they're going to go? And then finally, we want to take into consideration what's the impact on the industry? Is this in the media? Is the media alleging that temporary help agencies, staffing agencies are unfairly participating? Is this creating a bad reputation for the industry as a whole? Is this causing a reputational damage to your company, that you might get them through this crisis and then lose the customer forever? So are you unfairly influencing the outcome? Do not unfairly influence the outcome. Do not put your temporary workers at risk of harm for physical or harm or harassment, and do not put the industry at harm for their reputation as you participate, if you choose to supply during a labor dispute. That guideline can be found on the member section of the website. Determine the right of refusal of replacement. I talked to you earlier about somebody finding out about a candidate that was placed, or their resume was sent for a job order. So the right of refusal, the right of referral, is a document that says, if two agencies submit the same candidate for a permanent job, how do you determine who has the right to receive the fee for it? And it really goes to, did you have a legitimate job order? Was it given to you as an order, or were you just soliciting resumes out to companies? Did the customer authorize you to submit the candidate? Did the candidate authorize you to submit their resume? Did you participate in the process of contacting the candidate and scheduling the interviews and scheduling the job offers and dealing with, counter offers and that kind of thing? And so, and then of course there's the date and time that the resumes were submitted, because sometimes companies and agencies unknowingly or unwittingly have got two people participating in the same job order with the customer, and two agencies are going forward, and candidates are not forthright with you about the fact that their resume might have already been submitted by somebody else. And so, once we try to if you do everything right along the way, and everyone does everything right along the way, it's going to be pretty obvious who has the right to the placement referral. And if it's convoluted, then it kind of takes you through the steps to determine who on balance has done the preponderance of work and had the most legal position to submit resumes in the first place. Headhunting for staffing professionals. So there's some guidelines about trying to recruit from your competitors and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. Compliance with the Competition Act. We talked about that already. Assignment completion dates. So it is the law. This is another one of those examples where decisions have been made in courts, and Ontario decided they were going to put it right into the Employment Standards Act that says that you must put in writing, if you know a completion date of an assignment, you must tell the candidate the completion date of the assignment. In previous sessions for legal staffing, we talked about the importance of giving completion dates so you can avoid the principle of implied layoff, because you failed to tell them that they were no longer to be working. You didn't give them notice of the end of the completion date. And so they go into this implied layoff status, which now has a trigger on it that would trigger a termination date in 13 weeks from now. And then you might end up having to pay them notice or pay in lieu of notice in 13 weeks from now. So the law in Ontario is fine, saying that you need to give them all kinds of information about their client and about you and about completion dates and job descriptions and so on. And so there's some guidelines that you can find with respect to that. There are guidelines with respect to the federal legislation around hazardous material in the workplace and who is is responsible. And the answer to that is we all have responsibility. Typically, it goes like this: that WHMIS documents, WHMIS training, core training, so people understand what WHMIS is, how it applies, the kinds of things that it applies to, what to do when where to go look for and find a material safety data sheet, knowing how to read a material safety data sheet. That's all what we call core WHMIS training. And that's the responsibility of the employer, which is the staffing agency. The worksite specific aspects of the actual material safety data sheets for a particular hazardous material is the responsibility of the client, that every time that they receive a shipment and have an inventory, something that falls under WHMIS, they're supposed to have the documents in those binders. And then it's the workplace employer, the customer's responsibility to show the workers where they are, how to understand them, and how to understand and how to interpret them. And so this deals with the employer of record typically being first the employment agency. And again, in other provinces, you can have a co-employment relationship, but they typically look at the employment agency as the first employer. In Ontario, they've codified it, written it right into the Employment Standards Act, that the employment agency is the employer. And then, of course, we've got this issue of joint and several responsibility. If someone were ever hurt at work and did not handle hazardous materials correctly, the first thing the Ministry of Labor is going to do is they're going to ask you questions about training and who was responsible for it, who did it, and proof that it was done. And it's very possible that both jointly, the customer and the employer, the staffing agency, can be held accountable. And it could be severed in that some of the responsibility can be found only for one of the two parties. And of course, there's policies that you can download with respect to discriminatory job orders, and we've talked to that at some great length. There's also information and operating guidelines about application forms, which are really specifically intended to do two things. One, only collect information that is not covered under prohibited grounds. In other words, only ask for information you're allowed to ask for. And sometimes questions on application forms are not intended to be discriminatory, but they are systemically discriminatory because you can imply information from it can be implied or found out or learned or used in a way that is inappropriate. And so we've got some guidelines around application forms. And so workforce transfer. I talked about this already. You've been the sole supplier to a big tire company, which is a provincial chain. Now they're looking to expand across the rest of the country. They have chosen another company to be the master vendor of their recruitment program. Your company is invited to respond to the RFP process to be one of the top 3 vendors in the program, and subsequently, you don't win that spot. You've been asked to work with the MSP, the master service provider, to conduct a workforce transfer. In other words, to take all of your temps or as many temps as possible of your existing temporary employees. You're not happy with the outcome, as you've had over 60 temporary employees working there. The final paragraph, you worked really hard to recruit and assign these employees. So you will immediately get on the phone with them and inform them through that you no longer have the business with Dusty Donuts. Started off with Thompson Tires. Third paragraph, Dusty Donuts. It's the same company. As well, you plan on an early morning meeting on site to coach them to the end of the assignment. In a week's time, you will place them in another customer's location. So the what this is saying is you are implying is that you're not going to participate with the workforce transfer. And you don't need to go way out of your way to provide all of your confidential information. You first have to go to your employees and say, hey, notice of termination of assignment. Your assignment's coming to an end. So we've got now an assignment end date. We've got an obligation to provide that. We know and have made a commitment to allowing our employees to make their own choice, to have the freedom to choose who their employer is going to be. So we can't intimidate them in any way or unfairly coerce them to leave, to put the screws to the incoming supplier and the customer. But there's no problem with you making an offer to those workers to say, hey, we've got another Dusty Donut or another Thompson Tires that we'd like to place you into. Would you like to accept that assignment? And of course, the incoming supplier is going to ask you for all the information about those temporaries, and you're not obliged to give all that information. But what you should probably do is say, hey, to a certain degree, we'll ask for permission for disclosure of something, like can we get a disclosure of private information for them to have your name? So the new supplier might come in on site and they might not ask anybody's name, but they might put everybody in the room together, or they might send out a group email saying, at the end of the day, this is happening. Dusty Tires, Thompson Tires, whoever it's going to be, is the new supplier. They're accepting application forms. They're going to be in the lobby on Friday. If you're interested in staying with us, we're interested in knowing that. And Dusty Tires will take your applications. That's all appropriate. But what's not appropriate is attempting to coerce or manipulate the employees to not have the opportunity of choice and to act in a way that is intended to cause harm to your client or to the customer on your way out the door. But we talked about bona fide occupational requirements when we were talking about when it's appropriate to use some criteria that might otherwise be discriminatory, but won't be considered to be discriminatory in this job. So I gave you weird examples about, heritage buildings with skinny spots and, equipment that cost gajillions of dollars, in safety situations that you couldn't ever allow a person to have an alcohol or drug addiction to operate that equipment. So there are things that we call a bona fide occupational requirement. In the context of the example I gave earlier, when we said who's got the right to referral, who gets the right to collect the fee, this is what we call a bona fide referral of a candidate. So it's things like, did you get authorization from the customer? Did you get a job order? The terms of your job order and submission of candidates been approved? Did you get the approval from the candidate to submit their resume? Did you negotiate some things? So this is what we call a bona fide referral of a candidate, opposed to just knowing that there's a company out there that always hires piping draftsmen for oil and gas industry. And so just as a matter of practice, every time you get a candidate with that on their resume, you submit it to somebody at the customer. That's not a bona fide customer candidate referral. This is the who's entitled to the fee. We already talked about that. Employer of record. Your customer, Call Me Contact Center, is a national contact center and has 40 of your temporary employees working there at one primary city location. You've received 3 calls this week from your temporary employees, very concerned, very angry, asking, why did I not get a gift card my Tim Hortons card at the holiday party last week. The customer held a holiday party. They gave out 200 gift cards to the 200 regular employees and did not give anything to us 25 temporary workers. What is going on here? Well, you know, let's the customer's not required to give the same benefits and treatment to temporary workers or not their employees. So you got to ask some questions. You didn't know anything about the holiday party? Had you known about the holiday party was coming up, shouldn't you maybe have had a conversation with the client, like what's going on there with respect to alcohol, with transportation chits, with gift cards, with gifts? What's going on? Because as the employer, you probably should have, if you're a good employer, tried to figure out how you can do those things for your employees too. There's nothing wrong with two employers being present and giving out gifts and benefits. And there's absolutely everything right about two employers ensuring that policies around alcohol and driving and taxi chits are consistent between temporary workers and the customer's employees. But there's no obligation of the customer to provide that to your employees. Have you spoken with the hiring manager for the last 8 weeks? Shouldn't you have known? Are you not having regular conversations to nurture and develop relationships of trust and confidence that are part of your service arrangement? Is stuff going on there that you didn't know about? You use the no news is good news. You assume that all is going well because you haven't heard otherwise. It's not a bad philosophy, you know, if I haven't heard anything, you know, it's there's a golf joke about the guy whose wife left him, and you know he said, that he was totally surprised that his wife left him, and he remembered back to the week leading up to their marriage 25 years ago, and they agreed, hey, if we love each other, if anything is going wrong here, we'll talk about it, right? They go, right. And then they go for 25 years where the golfer goes out and golfs every Saturday and Sunday morning and doesn't spend his weekends with his wife. And then he's angry and frustrated because he thinks his wife broke the promise. She said that she would tell me if anything was ever wrong, and she didn't tell me. I mean, it's not a good joke. I'm not telling it well. But I mean, this whole notion of no news is good news. If I don't hear anything, then obviously nothing's changed. That's irresponsible. It's unprofessional. It's irresponsible. It's unkind. So the no news is good news isn't a good excuse for not knowing that the employees were going to go on a company party and the temps were involved. The customer's been your customer for 18 months. The reason why I think that they put this 18 month in there is because there might have been a Christmas party last year too. You ought to have known these things. So, putting a blind eye to some things and pretending you don't know, ignoring some things that are obvious is not really a great way. The matching game, employer of record. So, understanding in common law, we talked about this the other day too. In common law, there are principles that are used, whether it's about unions, whether it's about accident prevention, whether it's about determining whether or not a person is an independent contractor or an employee, determining who the employer of record is. In common law, there have been gajillions of court cases, everything from workers' compensation to union agreements, about how you determine an employer of record. So they look at some of these things. Who provides the site-specific training, safety training? Who provide or other training? Who determines the rates of pay? Who determines who's going to coach and counsel employees on everything from their employment performance to their attendance to their personal issues? Who manages the workers' compensation account? Who administers the general safety training? Who provides employee perks and benefits? Who supervises the employees at the worksite? Direction, control, and supervision is the phrase that is used in law. Who determines when the assignment's going to start and when it's going to end? Who has the ultimate power to hire and fire, which is different from who has the ultimate power to begin and end an assignment. In the absence of legislation, like in Ontario, where it specifically says that the temporary staffing agency is the employer of record, and in this case, it's giving you some examples, mostly probably around workplace health and safety, injuries, and workers' compensation. But it also goes to other issues like pay, equality of pay, human rights, termination, so on and so forth. In other provinces, it may not be so clear because it's not written into legislation. So they go back to the things that are clear, which are the common law decisions that have been made over the years and various court decisions. And they look at all of these criteria. They also look at the supply of tools and equipment. They look at the risk of economic loss. So does the person, so who provides tools and equipment? So if somebody's supplying a truck, that makes them more the employer than the agency who didn't supply the truck. But in Ontario, the agency is the employer. Who, if you send a person to work and they have to hire their own employees, they have risk of economic loss. That makes them more of an independent contractor. It's not who's the employer, it says, are they an employee? So in safety, we've got all of these criteria. And then we also have things like the integration test. They look like and treated exactly the same as other employees, risk of economic loss, and the supply of tools and equipment. And the more expensive and the more ownership is to provide tool and equipment, the more likely it is that that person will be the employer. So those are some of the tests with respect to employer of record. It is expected that staffing service firms that retain temporary orders remit appropriate source deductions. If you are supplying independent contractors in temporary employee roles to have cost savings, you may end up having a short-term gain, but liable in the long run. So in Ontario, recently, the Ontario government said you can treat technical professionals, IT professionals as independent contractors, which pretty much said, but if you're a staffing company, you cannot treat administrative, light industrial, and other people as an independent contractor. So number one, we asked, who is the employer of record? Is it the customer or us? And then secondly, is there an employer of record? Are they an independent contract, i.e. are they an independent contractor or employee? And in most provinces, they'll look at all the criteria that we just described to you in common law for determining the status of an employee and employer of record. In Ontario, it's written right into the statute. It's always the staffing company, unless it's IT and technical independent contractors, in which case neither your customer nor the staffing company has to be the employer of record. So there's an exemption on that law for IT professionals and technical professionals. Okay, managing your business, and we're rolling into the last section of it. It's like, how do some of these policies and practice apply to us? Well, first off, we need to manage our clients' behavior. So having regular contact and communication with our clients is important. Having terms of business written in an agreement or contract is important. To follow up and do your due diligence to ensure that what you wrote down and what you thought was going to occur is in fact happening is important in managing your client's behavior. We have to have some type of reporting, some way to capture data, to know things like, has there been discipline of an employee? Did somebody get hurt? Have there been issues around punctuality and attendance? How much did they get paid? All of the accurate keeping of information and reporting will also help to manage your business. We need to manage candidate and employee behavior. Do they know these rules? Do they know that they are your employee, not theirs. If we're very specific in our contracts and our employment agreements and our communication and our discussions with our employees about who the employer is and who they report to and what issues they need to come to the staffing company for, then it is far less likely they're going to get angry about not getting a Tim's card. They will understand. They will say, boy, my staffing company sucks. They didn't give us a Tim's card, but I'm not going to be phoning up my customer and blaming them. They're not my employer. They're our customer. So we also need to have this prevention, because when we don't handle these things correctly, they can end up in contract disputes, loss of contracts. They can end up in legal situations where there's litigation. They can end up in penalties and fines from the government. So managing your client's behavior, keeping track of your information, managing your candidate behavior is how we prevent harm and we avoid the serious consequences. We can go to the ACSESS website, to the members only section, and you can download those guidelines and you can read them in order to protect your practices and business. Now, not adhering to ACSESS guidelines could result in one of the following things. I got ahead of myself. I just told you. Loss of credibility within the industry, with clients and with candidates and the general public. You could have a reliability, legal lawsuits resulting in thousands of dollars, huge damages. You could have loss of business by losing a customer. Loss of clients, loss of business ownership. Sometimes the fines can be so crippling that they might force a company into bankruptcy. They could result in injury because they're not followed properly, even result in death to a person. Now, I'll give you an example. The name of the company is on the tip of my tongue. I don't want to say it in case I'm wrong. But many years ago, a temporary staffing company was transporting their workers in a company van from pickup places to a company location. And they were light industrial or agricultural workers. I think they were light industrial working in a warehouse. They crossed a level crossing without a gate, and they went in front of a train, and many or all of the people, temporary workers in the van, died. And so all of a sudden, we've got workers' compensation. We've got civil litigation. Were they at work? Or were they not at work? When they were getting a ride to work in the company van, were they at work? Or were they not at work? Were they paying for the ride, which we're not allowed? We recommend we don't get people to do. If they paid for the ride, was it like paying for a cab? So it wasn't the company, it was the driver or the rental company of the van or something? Was the customer responsible? Did the customer participate in the decision? Did the customer give the contract to the supplier exclusively and based very significantly on the fact that they promised that they would drive them to work? Was the driver certified? Was the driver properly insured? Was the driver trained? Were there more people in the van? There's have to have a different type of driver's license and a different type of insurance when you're transporting more than a certain number of people in a passenger vehicle. All of these things ended up in death. They ended up in massive financial litigation, huge fines from the Ministry of Labor, changes in the legislation, harm to the company's reputation, harm to the customer's reputation, harm to the industry's reputation. So we think that it's not important, but it is. So here's an interesting case. This one goes back to 2013, and the reason why we keep some of these cases around is because it was a groundbreaking decision in Canada. It was the first decision. Several other cases have come to light since then, and they get resolved pretty quickly because this one set the standard. Now, it doesn't really include a temporary staffing company, but it's a wonderful example because it's analogous to so many things that can and do happen in the staffing services industry. And this one had to do with a bunch of temporary foreign workers who came in from out of country. They worked for Denny's restaurant under contract under the temporary foreign workers program. So if you're not familiar with the temporary foreign workers program, this is where a company goes out and they make application with the federal government for prove that there are not enough workers, and they've tried really hard to find enough workers to fill their jobs that are often seasonal, but maybe not seasonal, maybe just a long-term shortage of that type of worker in Canada. And so they get what's called an LMO, a labor market opinion, which gives them approval to use temporary foreign workers. And then they go out and they find workers from another country, very often using a third party in the other country to help them source, find, and attract those candidates. You make them job offers. There's very special for a period of time. Most of them have a limit of 2 years maximum on it, but very often the LMO says it's for 6 months or 9 months or during a particular season. Then they have to go back to whence they came from. There are very specific laws protecting those workers. Things like you have to provide them housing, you have to provide their transportation, you have to provide them access to good food. If they're living in a house, they have to have private bathrooms, locked doors on their bedrooms. You can't take their documents and hold their documents from them. There's very specific legislation around this. And so what happened in 2013, first of all, this was the first class action lawsuit, and it involved more than 70 temporary workers. The workers alleged that they were paid thousands of dollars in recruitment fees to a recruiter in their source country, or maybe here in Canada. And Denny failed to provide the amount of money or work that was promised to them in terms of overtime and schedules. So they were offered either 40 or 44 hours a week, and they were often given much less than that. They alleged breach of contract, breach of fiduciary duty, and unjust enrichment. Unjust enrichment means that Denny's made a lot of money unfairly off of their backs. The workers also maintained that during this dispute, when they went to their lawyers, that Denny's was trying to intimidate them from participating in the lawsuit. And this led a court to give a court order that said, hey, if people decide to leave, we think that I think the well has already been poisoned. This has probably already happened. There doesn't seem to be any real good reason why people would remove themselves from the lawsuit. So they said there would be no repercussions to people who participate in it. So they banned Denny's from firing anybody or whatever because they participated. And then even so, after that, a quarter of the employees opted out. 17, 18 people opted out of the lawsuit, raising the question as to whether Denny's was effective in intimidating or maybe even offering something in exchange for them to leave. And the court said, nah, doesn't matter. We're going to include them anyways. And it became apparent that the employees were going to win, Denny's was going to lose. So the lawyers and Denny's entered into settlement. Because it was a class action suit, the settlement had to go before a judge, and the judge approved the settlement. And the settlement included approximately $1.4 million in payments to be spread out amongst all 70 of the workers. And it boiled down to that they were given, those who were promised 37 or 40 hours a week were paid any shortfall for the amount of hours that they actually received, plus they received overtime pay if they did work overtime. They were reimbursed for their airfare to get from their place of origin to Canada. They were reimbursed all of their agency fees by Denny's. And then Denny's also, as a sign of good faith, donated to a migrant workers organization. So where's the temporary agency coming to this? Well, it doesn't really specifically, but the analogy is this. Here's a bunch of temporary workers all being arranged by a third party, being treated unfairly by the client, and that the workers in themselves were vulnerable workers, which often are, I'm not going to say that all temporary workers are vulnerable workers, but in some types of work, temporary workers are vulnerable workers. They don't know their rights. They're treated unfairly by their clients. Their agencies don't stand up for them. Their agencies may accept discriminatory job offers or do things like pay cash and treat people like independent contractors and put them into packed vans and drive them to work. And so this case pretty much gives us a pretty good example. It says temporary workers have a right to get together, band together, and complain legally in a class action suit against their employer, which would be the temporary service company and the client if it involved temporary workers. So we talked about managing unethical behaviors of the client. That means that we don't accept discriminatory job offers. We don't give them information to allow them to breach confidentiality. I gave you the example this morning where a customer asked for all the phone numbers, email addresses, and information of the workers who were on assignment. We don't provide false information in our job qualifications. They don't provide false information, the job qualifications, safety on site, or financial status of the organization. So we want to try to get clients to prove they can pay. We want to get clients to prove through due diligence that their work site is as safe as they said it is. We want to make sure that the job orders they give to us are accurate so that we can protect our workers. We want to manage our company's customers around not paying fees. I can't tell you the number of times I've been asked to go to court on behalf of an employment agency to be the expert witness because the customer refused to pay a fee, and their fee refusal was based upon things like another agency sent them, or I didn't like the worker, or it turned out the worker didn't have the qualifications they said that they had, or the worker quit on us after 2 years or 1 year, or there was multiple agencies involved. I think I gave that example. And so by managing our clients' behavior, we can also make sure that they understand what their obligations are in paying their fees. And of course, we want to have customers be honest about us, about what they talk about exclusive contracts. And of course, if they give out an exclusive contract to 2 suppliers or 5 suppliers, it's not an exclusive contract at all. And very often we capitulate and negotiate terms of our agreements, thinking we're the only ones working on this, so we don't have to worry about losing the order after a week of unsuccessfully filling this job order. We often ask in the search business for retainers to kind of lock the person down. If they do want to go work with another agency, they're not going to get their retainer back again. But in the contingency business, we very often have to rely upon the honesty of our clients, that they don't have the order out with 5 or 6 other companies. And we lowered our price thinking they're going to give us a month to fill this. But a week later, we've just wasted a week worth of work because they got it filled by another agency. And we also need to communicate and manage our candidates to let them know who is the employer of record, and request screening when it's not mandatory. So managing our clients also means that if they're asking us to do, say, for example, background criminal checks or credit checks on people who have no access to anything at all, I think the example I gave before was the person laying sod has to pass a background check for financial credibility. That would be totally inappropriate. Communicating with your clients and employees about a workforce transfer. Again, we talked at length about workforce transfer, but communicating with our customers and our clients about that will help us to be prepared to remove the likelihood that there's going to be problems in our business operations. So we can do research on our customers' websites, we can look up their safety records. We can ask them for their official job descriptions. We can talk to the supervisors about their expectations. We can ask them about candidates who have already worked there before, what the policy will be about seeing those people again. We can talk to employees that are working there, get their opinions about what kind of place it's like that. We can look at media and press releases about changes that have taken place in the business. There's lots of ways for us to do our research. And then after we've done our research, we've negotiated our contracts, we want to document. We want to document things in our contracts and our agreements that follow a code of ethics, and have all of our documents audited by third parties. So we would have lawyers and accountants and people look it over to make sure that it's all good. Our communications with customers, employees regarding performance is really an expectation. So if they're going to do performance reviews with candidates, that's okay, or our employees, I mean, so long as they include us in it, or copy us in it, or let us participate in it, or better off, have us be present and conduct it. We need to be aware of the roles and responsibilities of employer of record. I went through that long list of how you determine an employer of record. You want to say, okay, you're responsible. We're responsible for WMIS core training. You're responsible for WMIS work site specific material safety data sheets. We're responsible for people proving that they've had core training. You're responsible for proving that they had work site specific training. We're responsible for withholding remittances to Canada Pension Plan Unemployment Insurance and paying people. You're responsible for paying your bills to us within a certain period of time. We lay these things out in a contract and in writing in a way that it's unambiguous. If we are aware of, as we are, because we're going through the CPC training, if we're aware of the legislation, if we're aware of the ACSESS Code of Ethics and Standards, and if we're aware of the ACSESS guidelines, then each of the contracts that we sign and the agreements that we enter into can always be crafted in a way that respect the spirit and intent of all of our knowledge and awareness. So yeah, there's some bad recruiters out there. It happens. And of course, the first way to avoid unethical recruiters is to do a better job in hiring the right people. But, you know, we're now talking about the same things. It's just directed internally. Choosing to work with clients on discriminatory job orders, we got to talk to our people about that and not permit them to work with clients who give us discriminatory orders. Using personal information illegally, so using candidate or employer or employee information or client's information in a way where we breach our covenants of confidentiality, fiduciary duty, and privacy. We need to have policies around that and manage our people to ensure that they're following the policies. If we have a lack of concern, or our recruiters have a lack of concern for health and safety, and they don't do worksite inspections, they don't ask customers questions about how many fingers and toes went missing and how they train people and how they follow up and supervise people, then we want to make sure that our recruiters know what the implications of that are with their employment in our companies. We sometimes have recruiters who knowingly and intentionally breach a client contract. And so, hey, story time. I had many years ago, I had an employee who was covering a desk of someone on a national account, on a major account. The person was away on vacation. And our contract required that we, number one, did a background police check. Number two, that we did a credit check. Number three, that we submitted the name of the person to the hiring authority and got authority to submit the resume, because they might have security or privacy or previous employment arrangements with that person. They might have been fired there before. They might have been screened and vetted a year or 2 years ago. And for reasons of, honesty, dishonesty, or whatever, they were rejected and they're not allowed to come back again. And so while the recruiter account manager was away on vacation, the person covering their desk skipped a couple steps, submitted a resume. The employee got hired on the temporary assignment because the end user in the department assumed that all that had been done. The person participated in a theft for $2.2 million. So you can tell already that this was a bank. It was a department where there was a handling of large transactions. And as it turned out, this bad person was sent to us 10, 12 times, probably sent to every supplier of every bank 10, 12 times under false pretenses, trying to get a job so they could get into apartment, because this crime organization, a scheme to defraud banks, but they just needed an insider. And they found that probably the weakest link was dealing with unethical recruiters, or at least recruiters who didn't know or diligently follow all the rules, and it was easier for people to fall between the cracks. Of course, the bank sued us, and we didn't lose the contract with the bank, but came very close to losing a huge, huge contract with that bank. My insurance company, I'm going to talk about insurance at the end of this, refused at the time to cover us because they said that we had violated a whole bunch of things that voided our insurance coverage. And so there were lawsuits. I had to sue my insurance broker. The bank sued us. There were negotiations and settlements, and money came. To make a short story even longer, the broker had professional liability insurance. So if the broker made an honest mistake and they got sued, they had insurance for that. Well, it turned out that the insurance company that insured us for theft and dishonesty was the same insurance company that insured the broker for professional liability. So the insurance company might have had a good case to not cover us because the insurance wasn't designed to cover all of these types of mistakes. But we had sent emails and letters to our broker saying, are you sure that this policy will cover this sort of thing, before we signed it? And the broker said yes, without any explanation as to why it might not be. So the insurance company had to cover, we had to cover the bank, the broker had to cover us, and the insurance company had to cover the broker, but our insurance with the insurance company wouldn't have worked. So this cost a lot of money, cost everyone a lot of money. It cost a lot of time. It was harmful to reputations. So managing unethical, in that particular case, it wasn't even unethical behavior of the recruiter. It was a poor business practice of the recruiter. And ultimately it was my mistake because we didn't ensure that the person working on the desk who was covering for a holiday knew how to do their job or would do the job the way that they knew to do it in an appropriate way. So breaching the client contract was sending people around the system. Breach of confidentiality of customer employees, misrepresenting clients or candidates is important. And recruiting from your clients, of course, we talked about the anti-rating clauses. You don't want your recruiters doing that behind your back. Restricting candidates to make the choice of their employment. We talked about that in workforce transfer. Managing unethical recruiters continues. Boy, they want to have a long list of bad recruiters. Recruiting from customers, using memberships in the association, added income through charging fees to candidates, being deceitful with candidates and clients about maybe the job, the nature of the job, the pay for the job, the location of the job, what the job will lead to, further promotions, stealing away other candidates and temporary employees. So we talked about when it's appropriate to fairly recruit and to unfairly recruit people from other companies, not to disclosing or declaring. If you've got a recruiter out there who's constantly trying to convince people that they're an independent contractor so that the recruiter can increase their gross margin and their commission, that would be inappropriate. Just aggressive tactics with candidates or clients kind of falls into the spirit of, am I doing the right thing? And so if you need to get things done because of threats and intimidation to either give people things that they wouldn't have already got or take things away, then we want to kind of manage that stuff. And again, we talked about the art of preparation. And again, I'm not going to go through all this because it's almost exactly the same as the last time. But if you prepare for these things in advance, you reduce the likelihood that they're going to happen in the first place. Okay, true or false? Your employee is working with your customer on a 6-month assignment. A week before the assignment ends, the employee applies for an internal job. You only hear about it when your client calls you to say that your employee went through the back channels to get in front of the hiring authority. Is this acceptable behavior as your candidate only has a few days left on the assignment? Look, there's no clear answer. At the end of the day, so long as the employee was not, the temporary worker, was not breaching some term of their contract around confidential information and fiduciary duty, and proprietary information and or patents and copyrights. If they simply heard about a job, their assignment is going to end in a week from now, and they went and applied for the job, you've got no right to stop them from doing it. The real appropriate solution to this would have been that you had a great relationship with them and they called you and said, hey, can you help me get this job? Are you going to charge a fee if I get this job? Is there any restrictions or things that are stopping me from getting this job? Do you have another job for me that's just like this job? They're having open, transparent, honest communication with regular dialogue back and forth so that people are accustomed to having these kind of conversations, not surprised that you would, when a person says, look, you haven't talked to me in 9 months, are you surprised that a week before my assignment, when you hadn't called me, that I took matters into my own hands? So, what are the circumstances that led up to this? Is the answer, is this acceptable behavior, true or false? The answer is, it really depends upon the circumstances that you've created inside your company to determine whether or not that was trustworthy, fair, or unfair behavior. So our temps do bad things too. And the more we put things in writing, the more that we put things into our contracts, the more that we communicate with our employees, are reducing the likelihood that bad things are going to happen. Some examples, I think I told you this before. The thing that I don't like about this presentation today and the format it's been in, we've been changing it over the years, is that it lists all unethical things. And maybe that's a way that you have to describe things that are illegal and bad and inappropriate. But if I can, I'm going to try to talk about things in the positive. How do we alleviate unethical behaviors? What is an ethical behavior? What are the things that we desire from people, that we want in our relationships? Those are ethical behaviors. And of course, the corollary, the opposite of those things that we want and desire and expect, are the unethical and undesirable behaviors. So, but candidates can misrepresent their skills and credentials. They can lie on their resumes or avoid disclosing certain information. They can misrepresent their salaries and their past income so that they can try to negotiate higher pay and income from you. They can also, this happens all the time in the healthcare business, is that people say, oh, I'm always available, but they're not. They've got a job at the hospital from Monday to Friday from 9 to 5, or they work on weekends at a clinic someplace. And they don't tell you that because they just say, I don't have a job. Because what they want to do is get the offer from you and find out which one's the best. And then, it might be great that you come up with something 4 days a week during the week while they keep their job on the weekend, but you might come up with a weekend job that pays twice as much or covers 4 days of the week that includes the weekend, and they'll quit their other job. So, or maybe they won't quit their other job. And what's even worse is when they lie about their availability, or they're not giving full disclosure about their availability, and then they accept an assignment from you and then tell you after the fact that they're not available to go to that job because they've given consideration to it. And they realize, oh, it's bad, I shouldn't quit that, or I should have talked to my husband or wife about it or something. So availability is often an area of dishonesty. The candidates can also use recruiters as bargaining chips, as bargaining leverage. And so they'll go to an employment agency and they'll say, can you help me find another job? They'll get their resume presented in a few places. They'll get some offers or have some interviews and find out what's going on. Then they'll go back to their employer and try to negotiate a better deal with their employer. And they never really had any significant or meaningful intent to leave their current job. They were mostly trying to use it as leverage in their negotiations with their current employers. There's also, they fail to follow through on their commitments, the circumstances. So they say, yeah, I'll start that job on Monday, but then they renege on the offer and they counter offer, and they have I had an office in Ottawa. Instead of calling it a fall off, they called it a non-start. They called it a bust out. Like people were busting out of prison. We had a bust out. and that was the term that they used in the branch for candidates that accepted a permanent job, and sometime between the date that they accepted it and the time they were supposed to start, they busted out of the arrangement. And sometimes candidates will find out about things through an agency, and the referral will be made, but then they'll start communicating directly with the client, thinking that maybe they can do a better job, or maybe thinking that if they avoid the fee, that they've increased their chances that they're more likely to get hired. And of course, candidates can always fail to provide references or provide false references. And, my definition of a false reference is that anybody who's giving a reference who isn't really a legitimate direct employer is a false reference. So having Uncle Joe, who, the person worked for on weekends 15 years ago, and not disclosing it was Uncle Joe, and not disclosing it was part-time, and those are false references. And so it's my recommendation, and this is, I don't want to get into your company's policies, but my recommendation is that when you're doing an interview with people and you see that a previous job or role or responsibilities is similar to the one that you're going to, that instead of saying, can you give me references, that you say, for this job 2 years ago, are you able to get me a reference of your supervisor from that job? And they're going to probably have to say, yeah, I'm going to have to go back and ask him or her, he's a great supervisor, and I'm sure that they would agree to that. But, asking for references in specific places opposed to receiving the, pre-typed list of the 4 pre-prepped people is probably a good way to avoid doing that. A complaint. So nobody likes a complainer. And of course, when there's circumstances that arise that somebody thinks is a violation of the association's guidelines or code of ethics and standards, the first solution always is try to resolve it. So if it's in your own company, with your own employee, try to resolve it. If it's with a client, try to resolve it. If it's a competitor who you think recruited somebody at an ACSESS event from you, probably best that owner of one company phone the owner of the other company and say, hey, I understand you're hiring so-and-so, and I'm a little concerned about how this went down. Are you aware that that went down? And very often, most often, people who have got a complaint raised, brought to their attention, want to do the right thing. They just didn't know what the right thing was, or they didn't understand the circumstances. Now, when you do make a complaint to ACSESS, there's no statute of limitations as to how long you have to wait for if you think another company is violating some law or human rights thing and they're unfairly competing because they're doing something that would be a violation of the ACSESS principles and code of ethics and standards. But typically complaints need to be done within a reasonable period of time, typically 30 to 60 days since the last occurrence of it. ACSESS has got an obligation to respond to that by sending it to committee within 7 days. So that gives the executive director, who would keep the information absolutely confidential and not disclose it to committees, to chapters, or other employees. That gives the executive director 7 days to attempt to intervene in an informal fashion, to contact the company that has the complaint against, say, hey, are you aware of the fact that a complaint has been made about you? And it's been put in writing. And we have an obligation to try to talk about this, to resolve things in an informal fashion. We got 7 days. And if a company says, yeah, well, geez, I didn't want that to happen, I didn't know that was happening, I'll never do that again. Here's my promise. Here's what I changed. Here's the new form. Here's the new application form. Here's the new policy. I didn't know that was a law. We've now put that into our policy. Then it should go away. And if it goes to committee, it's kept confidential in the committee, and very often sent directly to the national board, so that it's not dealt with at a local level, so that unintentional biasness can occur in harming the people's reputations who participate in the complaint process. Okay, so finally, normally I just say to people, hey, here's your bonus session on insurance. Um, we now have a slide on it. I think that over time, we might document more about this. I'm a little reluctant to document too much around insurance because of two things. Number one, people go to university and get professional designations in insurance. And I didn't go to university on insurance. I've purchased every kind you could possibly imagine. And we've negotiated insurance policies on behalf of the industry with insurance providers. So I'm knowledgeable, but I'm not certified insurance agent or broker. And the other thing is that everybody's insurance policy and every insurance policy has got differences in it. And so trying to be too specific with you might be misleading. So we're going to talk about the types of insurance that are available. And the reason why we're going to talk about insurance is because almost certainly every contract that you sign with your customers is going to have insurance requirements. And it is uncannily common that suppliers, recruiters, company owners, branch managers sign supply contracts for recruitment, permanent placement, executive search, contract placement, and temporary help with customers, not even knowing what those insurance and indemnification clauses mean, or whether or not they actually have the insurance that is necessary to cover them from their commitments that they've made in the contract. So first off, CGL, commercial general liability. This is the cornerstone of insurance. This is the basic insurance that all companies that have insurance have. Commercial general liability insurance will typically cover things like someone slips and falls and hurts themselves on your premises, or someone comes to your office and is offended by something that happened there, causing them significant financial harm. This is the type of insurance, I call it the Wile E. Coyote insurance. If the roadrunner is if the Wile E. Coyote's job is to forget job, the Wile E. Coyote drops an anvil on your head and somehow it happens to be your responsibility or fault, then commercial general liability insurance will cover it. Now, commercial general liability insurance is almost always associated with a property insurance policy, and that property, and they're tied together. And that property insurance policy covers your offices and your equipment and automobiles. Could include your automobiles. Property insurance will cover things like damage through accidents, fire, water damage, theft. So people steal your stuff or break your stuff, or it gets damaged in a fire, then property insurance will cover it. And very often commercial general liability and property insurance are tied together in the same policy. And so it'll list out the amounts of the premiums, and it'll list out the types of coverage, and then it'll list all the things that are in there. Then very often in separate policies, sometimes included, but in separate policies or in separate terms, there's what we call agency errors and omissions insurance. Now, they're not going to use the word agency. They're just going to use the word errors and omissions. Also, the contractors' errors and omission insurance, they're probably not going to use the word contractors. You're going to have to read the terms of the policy to understand. So what agency errors and omissions insurance means is this. It's very often useful for permanent placement agencies, executive search and search consultants, because, and in my opinion, it's not very useful. Many contracts require you to have errors and omissions insurance. And so people go out and get this not very useful agency insurance because it's really cheap. And the reason why it's very inexpensive is because it's not very useful. There's not very many cases, or likely any cases, that circumstances will arise that would trigger the payment of some loss. So errors and omissions means that somebody forgot to do something, overlooked something, or did something wrong. And as a result of that, in the delivery of their service, of their business, caused someone some harm. So what could an agency do that would be not covered under the terms of their contract and just resolved in payment dispute? That it actually went to insurance. So let's say, for example, Steve Jones is an engineer who builds bridges, and the other Steve Jones is an IT professional who built a game that builds bridges. And we're interviewing and recruiting and so on, and we send a person to go work on a contractor for a permanent job to build bridges. And for some reason, the customer believes everything that we said, but we sent the wrong Steve Jones. And so Steve Jones, the IT game maker, gets asked to design the structural steel for a bridge, and they build the bridge, and the bridge falls down. All the cars land in the river. How likely is that scenario? That we would take the service that we provide, which is attracting, identifying, evaluating, submitting, and negotiating candidates that match up to a customer requirement. And that in doing that, we made such a huge mistake. We omitted to check to see if their social insurance numbers or birth dates or that their picture identifications was the same person. And we put the wrong Steve Jones in the job, and the bridge fell down. Most errors, mistakes would be, hey, you did a crappy job. You didn't do something. This candidate, I paid you money and the person quit in the first week. That's not an error or omission. That's a bad outcome. That's bad food. You go to a restaurant and you don't like what you eat, refuse to pay, but you don't have a lawsuit against the restaurant for an error or omission. They just don't know how to cook. It just tastes bad. And so how likely is it that errors and omission insurance, agency errors and omission insurance, will kick in? And if we talk to some brokers who are honest with you, they'll tell you, yeah, I've sold 700 of those policies in the last 20 years, and nobody's ever made a claim. Now, once people started to figure that out, some other insurance companies came along and said, let's offer contractors insurance, because what they really wanted was IT professionals and engineers and other technical types of independent contractors and contractors for there to be insurance that if in fact they did make a mistake and the bridge fell down. So I'm not talking about the mistake in Steve Jones. I'm talking about they went to work and they put the wrong weld size or bolt tension in a hole. And as a result of that, the bridge was built in a faulty fashion and the bridge fell down. The engineer screwed up their engineering. They made an error or an omission. So if you have insurance that covers the errors and omissions committed by the contractor in the context of them doing their job, you can imagine that's going to be more expensive. That if a person builds something and the building falls down and they decide to sue the engineering firm, and the engineering firm tries to mitigate their damages by suing the agency, the question's got to be, did the contractor who came from the agency actually draw that drawing? Did they approve it? Did they stamp it? Did they sign it off? Were they properly supervised? Were they an engineer? And if they were, do we have insurance to cover that? Because that person made a mistake. So that's IT and technical engineering, technical contractors, errors and omissions insurance, opposed to agency errors and omission insurance, where the agency employee made the mistake or the error. So then we have directors' liabilities insurance, and directors' liabilities insurance is the kind of insurance that every charity should have, because most charitable directors are not getting paid. And so they come there and give their good time, they give advice, and something goes wrong and they sued the board of directors for their bad advice. Now, Private companies also have directors, officers and directors. They've got their CEO and their CFO, and they've got their board of paid board members who may or may not be shareholders, and they're paid to come and give their advice. And so there's a perfect case of ClubLink Corporation, who one of the several years ago, one of the golf courses in Muskoka had some golfers, young people, around drinking age. I can't remember if there was a case about them being underage, but around just drinking age, 19 years old, went into the clubhouse after golf, drank too much. The golf course tried to take their keys away from them. They were unsuccessful in getting the keys away from everybody. The young folks got in the car, drunk, drove away from the golf course and drove off a bridge, and several of the young adults died in the river. The families sued ClubLink Corporation, and they sued the board of directors and for having bad policies and direction. And I believe that the board of directors won that because the policies were in place. The golf course tried their best to not allow people to get in their cars. They probably shouldn't have allowed people to drink that much in the first place. Since then, laws have become very clear about how liable alcohol serving establishment will be with respect to over serving. I think Smart Serve came out as a result after that, which is certification of servers and serving alcohol. So, a lot of things came out of that. But directors' liability insurance would cover the court case to defend those directors and officers. And then if there was a loss, up to the maximum premium policy coverage would have covered those directors had they lost the case. So insurance and things like directors' liability insurance, errors and omission insurance doesn't only cover the loss, but it should cover a lot of the legal fees covering the court case itself. Theft and dishonesty insurance. Often old school folks call it bonding. Are your employees bonded? When somebody says, are your employees bonded? What they mean is, do you have an insurance policy that covers me, a third party, in case your employee steals from me? So bonding insurance could cover first party or third party theft and dishonesty. It's important that the policy lays out exactly who's being covered, because some of the policies will say something in legalese like the employee must have a manifest intent to cause harm to you, and you is the named insured, the policy holder. So ABC company, staffing company, goes out and gets in theft and dishonesty coverage, policy coverage for $1 million. The temporary worker steals from the customer. So remember, we talked earlier today, that wasn't actually a temporary employee, that was a permanent placed employee. But the temporary worker steals from the customer. The first question is, does it have a clause in it that says they must have a manifest intent to cause harm to you? Because what it means is the employee had to know or think that they were stealing from the agency, not stealing from the client themselves. If they knew they were causing harm to the client and stealing from the client, then this policy doesn't cover. So along comes new theft and dishonesty policies that extend that policy to the customer, to the third party. And it has to specifically have a clause that says that it's covering the other folks, not just the agency. So if you steal from the accounting department at the agency, almost all theft and dishonesty policies would cover. If they steal from the client, only those bonding, we don't call them bonding anymore. We call it theft and dishonesty. In the old days, they called it bonding. And when they meant by bonding was, are they bonded? That typically meant that first you have your insurance policy, and secondly, that the policy requires that you do some kind of security background or police check on them. So they're bonded employees. So theft and dishonesty often covers the agency if you steal from the agency. and special policies that name the customers or specifically say that it covers a policy for third-party losses require special terms and conditions. The professional liability policies or clauses cover a company on things like sexual harassment, failure to train someone. So professional liability looks at the professional conduct of the policies and the implementation of the policies around things like unlawful dismissal, firing a person without giving them proper notice. And the policies will be very specific about what they cover and what they don't cover. A lot of agencies don't have professional liability insurance. There's always special kinds of insurance, like medical malpractice insurance, caregiver abuse insurance. So there's always special policies that when you're delivering a service in a specialty industry, that industry is accustomed to having policies that are clauses that will cover those unique aspects of their industry. Automobile insurance, usually companies only have automobile insurance for situations where they own the automobile and the automobile is used by the employee specifically for work. Usually, often, a company might pay for the automobile, but the employee is responsible to go out and get insurance because the insurance company doesn't care who's paying the lease payment on an automobile. They care about who's driving it. So if a company gets a car and gives it to an employee, then they say, hey, employee, you're responsible for getting your own insurance. Make sure you tell them that 50% of the time you're using it for work. So you can get an insurance policy that's paid for by the company, or you can have a car paid for by a company, but the employee is responsible for the insurance. So then we have this other thing called non-owned automobile. And in non-owned automobile, that might be the circumstances where the employee is driving their own car for work. They have their own insurance. They get into an accident, something happens to them or to somebody else. And somebody sues the policy holder on the car. So car A bangs into something, causes damage. Something sues the owner of car A, who has the insurance policy for all the things that happen to car A. That's what happens to all of us. We all have insurance on our car, whether we drive it for work or we don't drive it for work. We have insurance on our car. It's car A. Something happens. You sue car A. Now you're driving it for work. So they also sue car A's employer. You're driving to work, driving from work, delivering something at work, driving people someplace at work. They sue the company. So the company has what's called non-owned automobile insurance, insurance that goes above and beyond car A's insurance to cover the company, because car A's insurance may not cover the company, probably won't cover the company. It'll only cover the owner of car A. So most companies have non-owned automobile insurance saying, you send a temp to go work for the customer's driving trucks, they've got insurance on their trucks, the temp driver crashes the truck, the customer's insurance on the truck covers the accident caused by the truck. But whoever was injured decides they're going to sue the staffing company also because the driver was an employee of the staffing company. That's where non-owned automobile insurance comes into play. So keep in mind, here's the two things. Number one, if you're driving temps on assignment, if your temps are driving on assignment, if you're driving for work, sales reps are going out on sales calls in their own cars. If you're transporting people around in somebody else's car, then the staffing company needs non-owned automobile insurance to supplement or augment, to go on top of that primary insurance that is required. The primary insurance is required by law. The supplemental non-owned automobile insurance is not required by law. So you want to have that insurance. When a customer asks you, do you have insurance? They mean non-owned automobile insurance, but they don't say it. So it's important when you respond back and give them a certificate, it says non-owned on it. So you don't try to imply that you're insuring their vehicles when your employee is driving it. Is that confusing? So automobiles, every automobile that's driven in a province, typically in that province, it's the law that there must be insurance on that vehicle by the vehicle owner or operator. And secondly, non-owned insurance is by companies that allow people to drive somebody else's car or truck. Okay, there's workers' compensation insurance, and workers' compensation insurance is required by law in certain industries in most provinces in all provinces across Canada. Some industries are exempt. Don't ask me why. Some industries are exempt, but workers' compensation insurance basically limits the amount that a person or a company can sue your company if there is an injury, a personal injury that occurred at work. So the whole point of workers' compensation is to stop what's happening, say, for example, in the United States, where somebody gets injured at work and then they get sued for bajillions of dollars in a litigious society. The law says, hey, if you work in one of these industries, the company must, by law, have workers' compensation insurance. Workers' compensation insurance pays this for that, pays this amount for that kind of injury, pays this amount based upon that calculation, and it limits and it caps at this amount, and companies can't be sued for stuff that is covered under workers' compensation. You can't have two lawsuits going at the same time. You can't even sue them at all. You got to rely upon the workers' compensation. So all companies need to have workers' compensation, and very often they're required to have a clearance certificate which proves to your client that you have got that coverage. And then there are two terms, several terms, in insurance, in customer contracts that say things about what should be included in the terms of the insurance. First off, they talk about additionally insured, and what the customer usually means, additionally named insured, and what the customer usually means is additionally insured. They might try to sucker you into signing a contract that says additionally insured when the only kind of insurance you're ever going to get is I'm saying it backwards. They may try to sucker you in to have insurance that says additionally named insured when the only kind of insurance you're going to get is additionally insured. What's the difference? The named insured is the company's name that is on and holds the policy. So I have a policy that covers me and my operations and my business and my things that happen. That's additionally named insured because I'm named on the policy. Additionally insured is things like commercial general liability or errors and omissions or theft, where a damage occurs to my customer and then I get sued by my customer. So they are additionally insured. So in order to be additionally insured, it covers us for losses incurred to our customer for things that we caused. So named insured covers damage to me. Additionally insured covers somebody else that happens by me. Very often, additionally insured and additionally named insured get confused in a customer contract where they ask you for a certificate that's got these clauses in it, and they sometimes ask for additionally named insured, and no insurance company is going to name your customer because it's not their policy. It will additionally insure them, but it will not name them. Next, joint and several. You'll hear the terms joint and several. It's pretty straightforward. It's confusing, and it's really confusing, but it's straightforward. Joint means your customer and you, or you're another company and you, somebody else and you are jointly sharing in liability. Several means that there are several parties that could be liable, and they could be separated. That you could have many people that could be liable, and the liabilities can be separated. And so typically contracts will say you were jointly and severally responsible. So they're trying to cover off both sides of it. And finally, we hear about indemnification or indemnifying. The supplier shall indemnify and hold harmless the customer for any damages that occur arising from the provision of their services. Now, most lawyers who are trying to trick you into signing a bad contract will say that the supplier will indemnify and hold harmless the customer for any damages that occur. Well, what does that mean? Any damages that occur? Of course, you only want to be included in some force of blame if the damage arose as a result of the service that you provided, not any service. So first off, what you want when you have an indemnification and hold harmless clause, you want to make sure that your contracts define what you're indemnified for. So a good contract might say things like, the supplier, you, the agency, will hold the client, will indemnify and hold harmless the client for any liabilities arising from the withholding and remittances of taxes, payroll taxes, Canada Pension Plan, and unemployment insurance withholdings and premiums associated with the worker's pay. So in other words, the customer is saying, hey, dude, you're the employer of record. In some provinces in the statute, it says very clearly, you're the employer and the employer of record. You got to withhold taxes from their check. You got to take off withholdings for Canada Pension Plan and unemployment insurance. You have to pay more than that in employer premiums. And if you don't do that, it's not my fault, Mr. Agency. It's your fault. You will hold us harmless. We cannot be harmed by your fault. You will indemnify us, which will mean you will protect us from any damage or harm or liability that will arise from your fault. And so what's happened in the contract is that it said you will indemnify and hold us harmless for, and it very specifically stated what we're indemnifying and holding no harmless for. It didn't say for anything that happens at any time by anybody. So very often when you have a contract that the customer gives to the supplier, says, you have to sign our contract. The customer's lawyers have loaded it up with all kinds of things that maybe you don't want to be held accountable for, and maybe you don't have insurance for, and maybe you can't even do. So there we have it. We talked about commercial general liability, property insurance, errors and omission insurance, and how there's two differences between agency and contractor insurance, director's liability insurance, theft and dishonesty, and the difference between bonding, where you're covering a third party's loss or whether you're covering your agency's loss, professional liability, where the bosses and the board of directors and people can be sued and held liable for the decisions that are made and the actions done by you and by your temporary workers. We talked a little bit about special insurance and the kind of things that it could cover. So if you're supplying nurses, think about medical malpractice insurance. We talked about the two different kinds of automobile insurance, the kind you have to have for the automobiles you own and the kind of automobiles you have to have where your employees are driving that somebody else has owned. Workers' compensation insurance. Boy, we could do 4 hours on workers' comp. And I told you a little bit about a couple of the confusing terms, additionally named insured, joint and several, and indemnifications. Ladies and gentlemen, we have successfully finished 15 minutes early today, which is my promise. I'm going to